Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I'm just a regular guy who spent most of my life working as an accountant in Seattle, driving the same routes, living a perfectly normal life. But what happened to me that November evening in 1996 on US 97? Well, it's been 28 years, and I still can't explain it. I'm not looking for attention or trying to convince anyone. I just need to get this off my chest because it still haunts me. My wife Janet and I were driving back from visiting her sister in Yakima. It was around 5:30 p.m., and the sun was already setting. You know how early it gets dark during Washington winters. We were heading north on US 97, somewhere between Blewett Pass and Peshastin. The road was pretty much empty, which wasn't unusual for that time of day and season. I remember every detail of that evening like it was yesterday. The temperature gauge on my '94 Honda Accord showed 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Janet had just opened a bag of trail mix, and the car smelled like peanuts and M&Ms. We had the heater running, and the local radio station was playing some country music. I think it was Garth Brooks, but I can't be sure anymore. The section of road we were on was pretty straightforward, a two-lane highway cutting through dense forest on both sides. My headlights were on, and I was doing about 55 miles per hour, maybe a bit less because of the fading light. Janet was excited about spotting a hawk earlier and kept scanning the sky for more birds. I remember telling her she wouldn't see much in the growing darkness. That's when it happened. My headlights caught something on the right side of the road. At first I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on my eyes, you know. But then this figure just stepped onto the road. I say stepped, but it was more like it glided. The way it moved. God, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. This thing crossed the entire width of the highway in 4 steps. 4 quick, fluid steps. Do you have any idea how unnatural that is? The road's at least 24 feet wide. I'm not great at math in pressure situations, but that's like 6 feet per step. And the height. I used to play basketball in college, so I'm pretty good at gauging height. This thing had to be at least 6 and 8, probably closer to 7 feet tall. It was wearing what looked like dark clothing. That's what my brain tried to tell me at first, but the more I think about it, the less sense it makes. The clothing didn't move like fabric. It was more like a part of whatever this was. There was something on its head too, almost like a beanie or a hood, but with some kind of point or protrusion at the top. The way it moved, though, that's what really gets me. Have you ever watched those nature documentaries where they show big cats running in slow motion? How their movements are so smooth and efficient? That's kind of what it was like, except this thing was upright. The stride was impossibly long, but there was no awkwardness to it. No stumbling, no adjustment for the uneven ground at the road's edge. Just 4 perfect fluid steps. I didn't hit the brakes. I know that sounds crazy, but everything happened so fast. By the time my brain registered what I was seeing, the figure was already disappearing into the trees on the left side of the road. No sound, no hesitation. It didn't even seem to acknowledge our presence. It just crossed and vanished into the darkness. Janet missed the whole thing. She was still looking up at the sky for birds. When I practically shouted, "Did you see that?" she just looked at me confused. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come out right. How do you describe something that your brain can't even process properly? I pulled over about a quarter mile up the road. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn the steering wheel. Janet thought I was having some kind of medical episode at first. I got out of the car, despite her protests, and just stood there in the cold, staring back down the road. The forest seemed different now, threatening somehow. The wind was moving through the trees, making that whisper sound that forests do, but it felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. I wanted to go back and look for tracks or something, any evidence of what I'd seen. But there was this feeling in my gut, this primal instinct telling me to get back in the car and drive. So that's what I did. We made it home that night, but I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room until sunrise, replaying those few seconds over and over in my mind. Over the years I've tried to rationalize what I saw. Could it have been a person in some kind of costume? Maybe, but who would be out there miles from anywhere in the growing dark? And that movement, no human moves like that. A bear standing on its hind legs? No way. The proportions were all wrong, and bears don't move like that either. I've read about Bigfoot sightings since then. A lot of them sound like bull, to be honest, but some of them describe things that feel familiar. The fluid movement, the impossible height, the way it just appears and disappears like it's the most natural thing in the world. I've never gone back to that stretch of US 97. Janet and I take the long way around now when we visit her sister. She thinks I'm being silly, but she didn't see it. She didn't see the way it moved, the way it seemed to belong to the forest in a way that made me feel like I was the intruder. I'm 65 now, retired, with grandkids who love hearing ghost stories. But I've never told them this one. How do you tell someone about something you saw that shouldn't exist? How do you explain that for a few seconds? Your whole understanding of the world just broke. Some nights when I can't sleep, I still find myself thinking about it. What if I had stopped? What if I had gone back to look for tracks? What if Janet had seen it too? But mostly, I wonder about what it was doing out there. Was it just crossing the road, going about its business? Or was there some purpose to it that I couldn't understand? I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, there are days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw that evening on US 97. I know those 4 impossible steps across the highway weren't a trick of the light or my imagination. Something was out there that night, something that wasn't supposed to exist. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if it's still out there, crossing roads in the darkness, moving through the forests of Washington like a shadow come to life. That's my story. Make of it what you will. I've never told it publicly before, and I probably won't again, but I needed to share it, if only to get it out of my head for a while. Maybe someone else has seen something similar. Maybe I'm not the only one who spent years trying to make sense of something that defies explanation. Or maybe I'm just an old man who saw something strange on a dark road a long time ago and never quite got over it. Either way, if you're ever driving on US 97 as the sun is setting, keep your eyes on the forest edge. And if you see something tall step out onto the road, well, maybe don't stop to investigate. Some questions are better left unanswered. This happened to me back in April 1994, when I was 15. I've never really told many people about it because, honestly, who would believe me? But what I saw that morning has stayed with me for 30 years, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I lived in a pretty rural area of western Pennsylvania at the time. Our house was set back from the main road, and I had to walk about a quarter mile down our gravel driveway every morning to catch the school bus. Usually I'd be out there around 6:15 a.m. while it was still pretty dark, especially in early spring when the sun wasn't up yet. That particular morning started like any other. It was chilly, probably in the low 40s, and there was this light fog hanging close to the ground. You know that kind of morning fog that just makes everything look a little weird and distorted? Yeah, it was like that. I remember wearing my favorite flannel jacket and carrying my backpack loaded with homework I'd stayed up late finishing the night before. The thing about our property was that it bordered this huge overgrown field that used to be farmland decades ago. It was all uneven terrain, with these scattered patches of tall grass and old fence posts sticking up here and there. Beyond that were some other houses, but they were pretty far off, maybe half a mile or so. Nobody ever went through that field because it was a nightmare to walk through. There were hidden dips and holes everywhere, and in the spring it was usually muddy and slick. I was standing at the end of our driveway, just kind of zoning out like you do when you're a tired teenager waiting for the bus. The sky was starting to get that pre-dawn grayish color, but it wasn't bright enough to really see clearly yet. I was looking down at my shoes, probably thinking about the math test I had that day, when something made me look up. I still can't explain what made me lift my head at that exact moment. It wasn't a sound. At least, I don't think it was. It was more like, you know that feeling when someone's watching you, that weird prickly sensation on the back of your neck? That's what it felt like. And there it was. This figure, just at the edge of the field, maybe 150 feet away from where I was standing. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it in normal terms, like, oh, it must be someone out for a morning run. But immediately I knew that wasn't right. This thing was huge. I mean, huge. I'm not talking about just a tall person. I'm talking about something that had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. It was moving fast, way too fast for something that size, and the way it moved was all wrong. You know how when you watch Olympic sprinters, they have this smooth, powerful motion. This wasn't like that at all. It was covering ground incredibly quickly, but in this weird, almost loping motion. Its arms, or what I assumed were arms, were way too long, swinging in this unnatural way as it moved. The whole thing was just this solid black shape against the grey morning light. I couldn't make out any details of its face or features. It was like looking at a shadow that had somehow pulled itself off the ground and started running. But it was solid, definitely three-dimensional. It wasn't like a trick of the light or anything like that. What really got to me was how it moved across that field. Remember how I said the ground was all uneven and treacherous? This thing was just gliding over it like it wasn't even there. It wasn't following any path. It was moving diagonally across the field, straight through the worst parts. No person could have moved that fast through that terrain without tripping or at least slowing down. The whole thing probably only lasted about 15 seconds, but it felt like time had slowed down. I just stood there, completely frozen. I couldn't have moved if I wanted to. My breath was making these little clouds in the cold air, and I remember they seemed to be hanging there longer than they should have, like everything was moving in slow motion. Then it just vanished. Not in a supernatural way or anything, it just disappeared behind some houses in the distance. 1 second it was there, this impossible black shape moving through the fog, and the next it was gone. The really creepy part? The entire time this was happening, there was absolutely no sound, nothing, no footsteps, no rustling grass, no breathing, just complete silence. After it was gone, I stayed rooted to that spot for what felt like forever. My legs were shaking so bad I thought they might give out. The worst part was that I still had to stand there and wait for the bus. There was nowhere else to go. I kept staring at the spot where I'd seen it, half expecting it to come back, but nothing happened. The fog just kept rolling across the field like nothing had happened. When the bus finally came, I practically jumped on. I remember the bus driver asking if I was okay because apparently I looked really pale. I just nodded and went to my usual seat. I didn't tell anyone at school what happened. I mean, how could I? Hey, I saw some giant black figure running through a field this morning. Yeah, right. But here's the thing that really messes with me, even now. About a week later, I overheard my dad talking to one of our neighbors. The neighbor was complaining about how something had been messing with his livestock. Said his horses had been acting really strange lately, getting spooked for no reason, especially in the early morning hours. And apparently, a couple of other people in the area had reported similar things. I never saw it again after that morning, but sometimes when I'm driving through rural areas early in the morning, I catch myself scanning the tree lines and fields. I still don't know what I saw that day. Was it a Bigfoot? Some other kind of creature? I honestly don't know. But I know what I saw was real, and it wasn't human. The thing that bothers me the most isn't even the creature itself anymore. It's the questions I can't answer. Why was it there? Where was it going? Why did it choose that morning to show itself? And why me? I've run through that morning in my head thousands of times over the years, and I still can't make sense of it. I moved away from that area years ago, but I've kept track of local news from there over the years. Every now and then, there's a story about strange sightings or unexplained phenomena in those parts. Nothing ever quite like what I saw, but enough to make me wonder if whatever I encountered that morning is still out there, still running through foggy fields in the pre-dawn hours, maybe showing itself to some other unsuspecting person. I know this all probably sounds crazy. Hell, sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember that feeling, that absolute certainty in the moment that what I was seeing was real, was solid, was there. And I know that whatever it was, it changed how I see the world. There are things out there we can't explain, things that don't fit into our neat, rational boxes. Sometimes they show themselves to us, even if just for a few seconds, and then they're gone, leaving us to wonder if what we saw was real or just a trick of the light in the early morning fog. I've never told many people about what happened that day. Even now, 44 years later, my hands get shaky when I think about it. My buddy Tom and I were fishing at Miller's Creek, our usual spot about 30 miles outside of Portland, Oregon. We'd been going there every summer since '75, and nothing unusual had ever happened. Until that August morning in 1980. It was around 6 a.m. when we arrived at the creek. The morning fog was still hanging low over the water, making everything look kind of grey and misty. The creek was pretty secluded. You had to drive down this old logging road for about 45 minutes just to get there. We liked it because hardly anyone else knew about it, and the rainbow trout were always biting. We'd been fishing for maybe 2 hours, and I remember I'd just caught my third trout of the morning. Tom was about 50 feet upstream from me, working this deep pool where we usually had good luck. The fog had mostly burned off by then, and it was turning into one of those perfect Pacific Northwest summer days. Not too hot, clear sky, just a light breeze rustling through the Douglas firs. I was just about to call out to Tom to see if he wanted to break for coffee when I noticed something weird. You know that feeling when the woods just go quiet, like somebody hit the mute button on nature? That's exactly what happened. The birds stopped chirping, no more squirrels rustling in the underbrush. Even the insects seemed to shut up all at once. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. I looked over at Tom, and he was already staring at something on the other side of the creek. When I followed his gaze, my heart nearly stopped. About 60 feet away, partially hidden behind a fallen log, was what I initially thought was a bear. But something wasn't right. The proportions were all wrong. This thing stood up. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with any bear. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. The body was massive, not fat like a bear, but muscular like a bodybuilder. But what really got me was the color. Every Bigfoot story I'd ever heard described a dark brown or black creature. This thing was different. Its fur was a kind of dirty blonde or light brown color, almost like dried grass. I couldn't move. My fishing rod was just hanging there in my hands, forgotten. The creature was staring right at us with these dark eyes that looked intelligent. That's the only word I can think of to describe it. There was awareness there, something that made it clear this wasn't just some animal. What happened next is burned into my memory forever. It took a step forward, and I swear to God, that single stride covered about 6 feet. Its legs were incredibly long and powerful looking. The way it moved was both graceful and terrifying, like an athlete, but one that could easily snap us in half if it wanted to. The really unsettling part was that it never broke eye contact, not once. It kept those eyes locked on us as it moved, slowly and deliberately, taking these massive strides along the creek bank. Each step was precise, calculated. It wasn't running away, but it wasn't approaching us either. It was evaluating us. I remember noticing details that seem absurd now, like how its arms hung down almost to its knees, how its head seemed to sit directly on its shoulders with barely any neck, and how its feet left these enormous impressions in the soft soil near the creek bank. Each print had to be at least 16 inches long. The silence was deafening. All I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears and Tom's ragged breathing upstream. Neither of us said a word. We didn't have to. We both knew that making any sudden noise or movement could be a terrible mistake. The creature continued its slow, methodical movement along the bank for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 2 minutes. Then something changed in its demeanor. It slightly tilted its head, almost like it was listening to something we couldn't hear. That's when it started to back away toward the tree line, still facing us, still maintaining that unnerving eye contact. Just before it reached the dense forest, it did something I'll never forget. It raised one of its massive hands and brushed aside a branch that was in its way. It wasn't a rough movement, it was deliberate and almost gentle. That simple gesture was so human-like it made my blood run cold. Then it simply stepped back into the forest and disappeared. The moment it was gone, Tom and I looked at each other. Without saying a word, we started packing up our gear. Our hands were shaking so bad we could barely reel in our lines. We'd been fishing that creek for 5 years, but at that moment, we both knew we'd never come back. The drive home was mostly silent. What do you say after something like that? Eventually, Tom spoke up. Did you notice how it seemed scared of us too? He was right. Despite its massive size and obvious strength, It had seemed just as wary of us as we were of it. Over the years, I've read countless Bigfoot encounters and stories. None of them quite match what we saw that day. The light-colored fur, the calculated movements, the almost human-like behavior. It was all different from the typical reports. I've gone over it in my mind thousands of times, trying to rationalize it, trying to convince myself it was just a bear or some other explanation. But I know what I saw. Tom passed away in 2012, and sometimes I wish I'd talked with him more about what happened that day. We both avoided the subject over the years, like if we didn't talk about it, maybe it would make more sense somehow. But it never did. I still fish, but I've never gone back to Miller's Creek. Sometimes when I'm out in the woods, I'll get that same feeling, that sudden silence, that prickle on the back of my neck. When that happens, I pack up and leave, no matter how good the fishing is. Some things you only need to experience once in your lifetime. That day changed how I look at the world. There are things out there we don't understand, things that don't fit into our neat categories and scientific explanations. I don't try to convince anyone about what I saw anymore. I know what happened that August morning in 1980, and that's enough for me. The older I get, the more I think about the intelligence I saw in those eyes. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, if it remembers us like we remember it. But mostly, I wonder about all the other people who've had encounters they never talk about, who carry their own unbelievable stories that they keep to themselves, afraid of the ridicule or disbelief they might face. I'm sharing this now because I'm 73 years old, and I figure it's time someone knew the whole story. I don't care anymore if people believe me or not. You don't forget something like that, no matter how many years pass. Some experiences change you forever, and that morning at Miller's Creek was one of them. I've never told this story publicly before, but what I saw that summer night in 1980 has haunted me for over 40 years now. I can still smell that distinct odor when I think about it, and sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night remembering those eyes, those terrifyingly intelligent eyes. It was late June, around 11:30 p.m. My husband Tom and I were driving back from visiting my sister in Portland, taking the scenic route through the mountains because the main highway was under construction. Tom had fallen asleep in the passenger seat about an hour earlier, and I was actually grateful for the quiet. The radio only picked up static out there, and there was something peaceful about being alone with my thoughts, watching our headlights cut through the darkness. The moon was full that night, casting weird shadows through the trees. I remember thinking how the shadows seemed to move, like dark figures dancing just beyond the reach of my headlights. I'd been driving these mountain roads for years, but something felt different that night. The air felt heavier somehow, and there was this oppressive silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I remember checking the gas gauge. We were running low, but had enough to make it to the next town. That's when the smell hit me. At first I thought something had crawled up under the car and died. It was this overwhelming mixture of wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something else I can't quite describe, like copper and musk combined. I actually rolled down the window thinking fresh air would help, but that only made it worse. The smell got stronger, and that's when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, illuminated in my headlights, this massive figure stepped out from the tree line. My first thought wasn't even Bigfoot. It was more like, why is there a bodybuilder covered in fur out here in the middle of nowhere? That's how muscular this thing was. It was easily 8 feet tall, with reddish-brown fur that looked almost auburn in my headlights. I instinctively took my foot off the gas, letting the car coast slower. The creature turned toward us, and I'll never forget how it raised its massive arm to shield its eyes from the headlights. That gesture was so human. But everything else about it was just wrong. Its proportions were off. Arms too long, shoulders too wide. The muscles in its chest and shoulders rippled as it moved, like a wrestler's but larger, more defined. When it lowered its arms slightly, our eyes met. I know how crazy this sounds, but there was intelligence there. Not animal awareness, but something deeper. Its eyes were dark, but caught the light in a way that made them appear almost amber-colored. They were set deep under a prominent brow ridge, and the face— God, the face. It wasn't ape-like at all, like you see in those blurry photos. It was almost human but twisted somehow, with a flatter nose and a powerful jaw. When it parted its lips slightly, I could see its teeth. They were darkened, like they were stained, but definitely not like any animal's teeth I've ever seen. It stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10, 15 seconds just studying us. It wasn't afraid, but it was cautious. The way it held itself reminded me of how deer sometimes freeze in headlights, alert but not quite sure whether to run. But this thing wasn't frozen in fear. It was deciding what to do about us. I remember my hands were shaking so badly on the steering wheel that the headlight beams trembled slightly on its massive form. That's when it did something that still gives me nightmares. It took a deliberate step toward our car. Not aggressive, but purposeful. Like it was curious. The muscle definition in its thigh was visible even through the fur as it moved. I could see its weight shift, see how its feet, God, they were huge, pressed into the asphalt. The smell was overwhelming now. That copper musk scent was so strong I could taste it in the back of my throat. Tom was still sound asleep somehow, his head lolled against the window, completely oblivious to what was happening. I wanted to wake him, to have someone else witness this, but I was terrified that any sudden movement would provoke the creature. It took another step forward, and I noticed how its fur moved in the breeze. It wasn't matted or tangled like you'd expect from a wild animal. It looked almost groomed, especially around its face and chest. Its movements were smooth, calculated. Each step was silent despite its massive size. That's when I noticed something else. It was watching my hands on the steering wheel. Not my face anymore, but my hands. Like it understood what they were connected to, what they controlled. My foot was hovering between the brake and gas pedal, and I was fighting every instinct to floor it. But something told me that sudden movements would be a terrible idea. This thing could probably flip our car if it wanted to. Its shoulders alone were wider than our hood. Then it did something that made my blood run cold. It tilted its head slightly, almost like it was trying to get a better look inside the car. That gesture was so human-like that for a moment I felt like I was looking at a person in a suit. But no suit could replicate the way its muscles moved under that fur, or the steam I could see rising off its body in the cool night air. I heard a soft grunt, not aggressive, more like it was thinking out loud. The sound was deep, resonant, something you felt in your chest more than heard. Then it slowly, deliberately, took a step backward. Its eyes never left mine as it retreated, still shielding them slightly from the headlights. Right before it turned away, I swear I saw something in its expression, not just intelligence, but almost like recognition, understanding. I know that sounds insane, but it's the only way I can describe it. It wasn't looking at me like I was prey or a threat. It was looking at me like it knew exactly what I was and had decided to let me be. It turned with this fluid grace that something that size shouldn't possess and walked, not ran, not lumbered, but walked, back into the tree line. The last thing I saw was its massive shoulder muscle flexing as it pushed aside a branch bigger than my arm. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, hands trembling on the wheel, before I could bring myself to drive again. Tom woke up about 20 minutes later and asked why it smelled so bad in the car. I tried to tell him what happened, but he just laughed it off, said I must have been tired and seeing things. But I know what I saw. That wasn't a bear, wasn't a man in a suit, wasn't my imagination. The way it moved, that impossible combination of power and grace, the intelligence in those eyes, that smell that lingered in our car for weeks afterward despite multiple cleanings. I've read other people's Bigfoot encounters over the years, but they always describe it running away or acting aggressive. What I saw that night was different. It was conscious, calculating, almost contemplative. That's what haunts me the most. Not the size or the strength, but the clear intelligence behind those eyes. Something that's smart, that powerful, has been out there all this time, watching us, staying hidden. And sometimes I wonder, was I really the one observing it that night, or was it the other way around? I still drive those mountain roads sometimes, but never at night anymore. And every time I pass that spot, I roll up my windows and hold my breath, half expecting to catch that copper musk smell again. I never have, but I know it's out there, and I know it remembers me too. I've never been able to forget that summer afternoon in 1978. I was 15, and what I saw by Miller Lake changed my life forever. I've spent the last 46 years trying to make sense of it, and even now, my hands get shaky when I think about it too much. Our family had moved to the outskirts of the Cascade Mountains in Washington state the year before. It was a small community, maybe 200 people at most, surrounded by dense forest and several lakes. My dad worked at the local lumber mill, and my mom taught at the elementary school. That summer was particularly hot, and I'd gotten into the habit of taking long walks around Miller Lake to escape the heat of our non-air-conditioned house. The lake was about a mile from our house, and I knew every inch of the trail around it. I'd walk there almost daily, sometimes to fish, but mostly just to get out of the house and enjoy the quiet. My parents were fine with it. Back then, kids had a lot more freedom, and everyone knew everyone in our small town. That day, August 12, 1978, started like any other. It was around 4 p.m. when I headed out. The sun was still high, but the worst of the day's heat had passed. I remember wearing my favorite blue t-shirt, jeans, and these beat-up Converse sneakers I refused to replace. I had my Walkman with me. It was a prized possession I'd gotten for Christmas, but I hadn't turned it on yet. I liked to listen to the forest sounds first. The trail around Miller Lake was about 3 miles long. I usually walked clockwise, starting from the north end where the small parking area was. The west side of the lake was rockier and less traveled because it was harder to walk on, but I liked it better because you could see fish jumping sometimes. I'd made it about halfway around the lake to the spot where the trail dips down close to the water. There's a small clearing there where people sometimes stop to fish. The air was dead still that day. No breeze at all. The lake surface looked like glass, and the only sounds were cicadas and the occasional splash of a fish. That's when I heard it, a sound like someone moving through water, but heavier than usual. At first I thought it was probably a deer. We saw them all the time coming down to drink. I slowed down and tried to move quietly, hoping to catch a glimpse. I'd gotten pretty good at spotting wildlife that summer. As I came around a bend in the trail, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. About 30 feet ahead of me, at the water's edge, there was this figure. It was crouched down, like it was drinking from the lake. At first glance, I thought it might be a bear. We had black bears in the area, but something was off about the way it was positioned. It was massive, way bigger than any bear I'd ever seen, and the proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, and even crouched down, I could tell it would stand much taller than a bear. The thing that really got me was how it was drinking, not like an animal at all, but almost like a person, cupping water in its hands. The creature was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair, not fur like a bear. This was more like human hair, but thicker and coarser. I remember thinking it looked almost rusty in the sunlight. Its muscles were visible even through the hair. This thing was incredibly powerful-looking. I stood there frozen, not daring to move. I don't know how long. Maybe 10 seconds, maybe 30. Then it happened. The creature sensed my presence. It stopped drinking and slowly began to turn its head toward me. That's when true terror hit me. Its face. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't human. It was something in between. The eyes were what got me. They were dark and intelligent, almost human-like, but there was something ancient and wild in them. The face was flat, more like a human's than an ape's, but the brow ridge was massive and pronounced. Our eyes met for what felt like an eternity, but was probably just a second or two. In that moment, I felt something I'd never felt before or since. A primal, bone-deep fear, but also this overwhelming sense of being in the presence of something that shouldn't exist, something that turned everything I thought I knew about the world upside down. Then it stood up. I'll never forget this as long as I live. It rose to its full height, and it was enormous. I'm not good at estimating heights, especially when you're terrified, but it had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, and its arms hung down past its knees. The way it moved was so fluid, so natural, not at all like a person in a costume. That's when my survival instincts finally kicked in. I turned and ran faster than I'd ever run in my life. I didn't look back, didn't think, just ran. I was jumping over logs and ducking under branches, my heart feeling like it was going to explode. The whole time, I was waiting to feel a hand grab me or hear it running behind me, but I heard nothing except my own panicked breathing and the sound of my feet pounding the dirt. I didn't stop running until I reached the parking lot, and even then I kept going until I was on the main road. By the time I got home, my shirt was soaked with sweat, and I had scratches all over my arms from running through branches. My mom took one look at me and knew something was wrong, but I couldn't talk about it. I just told her I thought I'd seen a bear and got scared. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those eyes looking at me. The intelligence in them was what really haunted me. This wasn't just some animal. There was awareness there, consciousness. It knew what I was, and I knew what it was, even though that should have been impossible. The next day, my dad and a couple of his friends went to check out the area. They found some unusual tracks near the water's edge, but the ground was too hard in most places to show prints clearly. What they did find was a series of broken branches high up on some of the trees, way too high for a person to reach. Here's the thing that really gets me. After talking to some of the older residents in town, I found out I wasn't the first person to see something like this around Miller Lake. Old Mr. Johnson, who'd lived there since the 1940s, told me about strange sounds he'd heard at night. Not quite human, not quite animal. Mrs. Peterson, who lived closest to the lake, talked about finding weird formations of broken branches and rocks that would appear overnight. The really crazy part. About a week after my encounter, 3 hikers reported seeing something similar on the other side of the lake. They described the same reddish-brown hair, the same incredible height. They even mentioned the way it moved, that weird, fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. I never saw it again after that day, but I never went back to that part of the lake either. My family moved away the following year when my dad got a better job in Seattle, but I've kept track of reports from that area over the years. Every now and then, someone reports something similar. Always around Miller Lake, always with the same details. Reddish-brown hair, incredible height, and those eyes. Those unforgettable eyes. I'm 61 now, and I've had a lot of time to think about what I saw that day. I've read all the scientific explanations, all the theories about misidentified bears or hoaxes. I've seen the blurry photos and shaky videos that show up on TV shows about Bigfoot. None of them quite capture what I saw that afternoon. I don't tell this story often. Most people either think you're crazy or they try to explain it away, but I know what I saw. That moment when our eyes met, it's burned into my memory as clearly as if it happened yesterday. Whatever it was real, it was intelligent, and it changed how I see the world forever. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I still think about those eyes looking back at me, and I wonder if somewhere out there, that creature remembers the skinny kid who stumbled upon it on a quiet summer afternoon. I wonder if it tells its own story about the day our two worlds briefly collided at Miller Lake. I've been hesitating to share this story for over 40 years now. Even today, my hands shake a bit when I think about what happened that October morning in 1979. My brother Tom and I had been hunting in the Cascade Mountains since we were teenagers, and we'd brought along our friend Steve for what was supposed to be a routine deer hunting trip. Nothing could have prepared us for what we encountered that day. It was October 12th, just before dawn. The air was crisp, and there was this heavy fog hanging low in the valley. We'd driven up in my old Ford pickup the night before and made camp near the base of Miller Ridge. I remember checking my watch, 5:47 a.m., as we gathered our gear. Tom had his Winchester .30-06. I had my Remington 700, and Steve carried his dad's old Marlin. Standard equipment for deer hunting in those parts. The plan was simple: work our way up the ridge before sunrise, find a good spot overlooking the valley, and wait for the deer to start moving. We'd done this dozens of times before, but something felt different that morning. The forest was unusually quiet. No birds, no small animals rustling in the undergrowth, just dead silence. We'd been hiking for about an hour when the fog started lifting. The sun wasn't quite up yet, but there was enough light to see maybe 100 yards ahead. That's when we noticed the first strange thing. A series of broken branches way too high up on the trees, maybe 8 or 9 feet off the ground. Tom pointed them out, joking that we had some pretty tall deer in the area. We kept moving up the ridge, and that's when the smell hit us. I've been in the woods my whole life, and I've never smelled anything like it. A mix between wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something else I can't even describe. Steve actually gagged a little. We figured maybe there was a dead animal nearby, but we couldn't spot anything. Around 7:30 a.m., we reached a small clearing about halfway up the ridge. Tom was leading, I was a few yards behind him, and Steve was bringing up the rear. That's when Tom suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. I nearly ran into him. He didn't say a word, just raised his hand slowly and pointed toward the tree line on the other side of the clearing, maybe 150 yards away. I'll never forget what I saw. Standing there, partially obscured by a large Douglas fir, was something that looked like a person. Except it wasn't a person. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a bulky frame. Its body was covered in dark reddish-brown hair. But what really got me was how it was standing, completely upright, just like a human, with one hand resting against the tree trunk. The thing that makes this memory so vivid, so real, was what happened next. As we stood there frozen, a smaller figure emerged from behind the larger one. It was maybe 5 feet tall, with the same colored hair, moving in that same eerily human way. The adult, that's the only way I can think to describe it, put its arm out, almost protectively, in front of the smaller one. They were watching us. Not like an animal watches you. This was different. There was intelligence in the way they moved, in the way they positioned themselves. The adult's head was slightly tilted, studying us with what I can only describe as curiosity. I could see its eyes clearly, dark and alert, reflecting what little sunlight was filtering through the trees. Steve started fumbling with his rifle, and that's when I realized my own weapon was hanging uselessly at my side. Tom had his rifle raised halfway, but his hands were shaking so bad I doubt he could have hit anything. Not that any of us were thinking about shooting. Something about those creatures, the way they were behaving, the obvious family bond, made that idea feel wrong. The encounter probably lasted no more than 2 minutes, but it felt like hours. Then, without any sudden movements, the larger figure gently guided the smaller one behind it, and they both moved back into the denser forest. They didn't run or crash through the underbrush like a bear or deer would. They just walked away, disappearing into the shadows with an almost graceful efficiency. We stood there for several more minutes, none of us speaking. The silence was broken by Steve throwing up behind a nearby tree, whether from fear or that lingering smell, I'm not sure. Tom finally lowered his rifle and turned to lock at me. His face was white as a sheet. We decided to head back down the ridge, all thoughts of deer hunting forgotten. About halfway down, we ran into another hunter coming up the trail. He was carrying a serious-looking rifle with a scope that probably cost more than my truck. When he asked if we'd seen any deer, Tom blurted out what we'd seen. The hunter's reaction surprised me. Instead of laughing or dismissing it, he got real quiet and serious. He told us he'd been hunting these mountains for 30 years and had seen things he couldn't explain. He didn't elaborate, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't joking. We made it back to camp in record time, packed up our gear, and were on the road by noon. The drive home was mostly silent, except for Steve occasionally muttering Jesus Christ under his breath. We tried talking about it later that night over beers, but words failed us. How do you describe something that shouldn't exist? I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what we saw that day. Could it have been bears, a guy in a costume, some kind of mass hallucination? None of those explanations fit what we experienced. The way they moved, the intelligence in their eyes, that protective gesture between parent and child, it was all too human. I've never gone back to that specific spot, though I've continued hunting in other areas. Tom gave it up completely after that day. Steve moved to Arizona a year later, claiming he needed somewhere with fewer trees. We don't talk about it much anymore, but sometimes when we get together during the holidays, we'll catch each other's eyes and know we're thinking about the same thing. I know how this story sounds. If someone had told me this before that day, I would have thought they were crazy or lying. But I know what I saw. Those weren't bears, they weren't people in suits, and they definitely weren't my imagination. There's something out there in those mountains, something that walks like us, thinks like us, and maybe even feels like us. I don't need to prove it to anyone. I just know that morning in October 1979 changed everything I thought I knew about what's possible. Every time I hear someone claim they've seen a Bigfoot, I don't laugh anymore. I just remember that morning, that smell, and those eyes. Sometimes late at night, when I can't sleep, I wonder if they're still out there, that parent and child, moving silently through the forests of the Pacific Northwest, watching us just as we watch them. It was October 27th, 1991, around 11:30 p.m. I was driving back home to Eugene after visiting my sister in Roseburg. The drive along I-5 was pretty routine. I'd done it dozens of times before. The night was unusually clear for Oregon in fall, with a nearly full moon casting an eerie glow over the dense forest on either side of the highway. I remember I had the radio turned down low, some late-night talk show discussing the upcoming Halloween festivities. The traffic was practically non-existent. I hadn't seen another car for at least 15 minutes. As I approached the Rice Hill area, I started that long climb up the grade. My old Ford Taurus was struggling a bit with the incline, so I had shifted into a lower gear. That's when I first noticed something wasn't right. About halfway up Rice Hill, I caught a glimpse of movement near the guardrail on the right side of the road. At first, I thought it might be a deer. We'd had plenty of close calls with them on this stretch. But as I got closer, my headlights illuminated something that made my blood run cold. There was a figure crouched down next to the guardrail, not like a person taking a rest, but in an almost animal-like posture. The moment my headlights hit it, the thing stood up. God, the way it moved. It wasn't like watching a person stand. It was fluid, almost like a dancer, but powerful. In one smooth motion, it went from being crouched to its full height. And that's what really got me. This thing had to be at least 8 feet tall. I know how that sounds. Trust me, I've spent years trying to convince myself I was tired or that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But I know what I saw. The creature was covered in long, shaggy hair, a deep brown color that looked almost reddish in my headlights. Its arms were impossibly long, hanging down past its knees. The build reminded me of those strongman competitors you see on TV, but bigger, more muscular. What really struck me was how it moved. For something so massive, it was incredibly agile. The moment it stood up, it turned toward the forest. I swear it looked right at me. I couldn't make out its face clearly, but I felt its eyes on me. Then it just moved. I don't mean it ran or walked. It covered ground in these long, fluid strides that seemed to eat up the distance between the guardrail and the tree line. The whole encounter couldn't have lasted more than 5, 6 seconds, but time felt weird, like those moments were stretched out. I remember my foot instinctively coming off the gas pedal, my car slowing on the grade. The creature disappeared into the trees, but the way the branches moved and swayed in its wake, it was heading uphill, moving through that dense forest like it was nothing. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Part of me wanted to stop, to back up and investigate. But there was this primal feeling in my gut, this deep-seated instinct telling me to keep driving. I listened to it. I didn't stop until I reached the Rice Hill Inn, about a mile up the road. I pulled into their parking lot, my heart still racing. The night clerk must have seen something in my face when I went in to buy a coffee because he asked if I was okay. I thought about telling him what I'd seen, but I couldn't get the words out. How do you tell someone you just saw something that shouldn't exist? The coffee helped calm my nerves, but I couldn't shake this feeling of being watched. The forest suddenly seemed more alive, more aware. I sat in my car for maybe 20 minutes, debating what to do. Part of me wanted to drive back down there to look for tracks or signs, but every time I thought about actually doing it, I remembered how that thing moved, how effortlessly it disappeared into those woods. I finally convinced myself to continue home, but I drove well above the speed limit until I hit Eugene city limits. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up watching TV, trying to distract myself from replaying those moments over and over in my head. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it had been a Halloween prank, some guy in a really good costume maybe. But the more I thought about it, the less sense that made. The location was too remote, the movement too natural, and that size, no costume could have captured that fluid grace, that raw power. I drove back the next day in broad daylight, I parked near where I thought the encounter had happened and walked along the guardrail. The ground was damp from recent rain, but any tracks that might have been there were gone. I did find something, though. About 15 feet up one of the trees at the forest's edge, there was a broken branch, far too high for any person to reach. It was a fresh break, the wood still light-colored and raw. I've spent years researching similar encounters in the area. Rice Hill has a history of strange sightings, though most people keep quiet about them. I've found old newspaper clippings about unusual tracks found in the area, stories from truckers about large shadows crossing the highway at night. What bothers me most isn't the initial shock of seeing something that shouldn't exist. It's the smaller details that have stuck with me. The way its muscles moved under that hair, how it seemed to know exactly where it was going in that pitch-black forest, the complete silence of its movement despite its size. No costume could replicate that. No person could move that way. I still drive that stretch of I-5 sometimes. I have to for work. Every time I pass that spot, I slow down a little, scan the tree line. I've never seen it again, but sometimes, especially on clear nights with a bright moon, I get this feeling, like something's watching from those woods, something that knows these forests better than we ever will. I know how this story sounds. If someone had told me this before that night, I probably wouldn't have believed them. But I know what I saw. That thing on Rice Hill wasn't human, wasn't any known animal. And the scariest part, I'm convinced it wasn't the only one out there. Sometimes I wonder if it saw me as an intruder, a curious observer, or just another passing car on its territory. I'll never know. But I do know that night changed how I view our world. There are things out there we don't understand, things that defy our neat, rational explanations. I just happened to catch a glimpse of one. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, sometimes I still have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I saw that night was real. And sometimes, on dark nights when I'm driving through wooded areas, I catch myself scanning the tree line, wondering if I'll ever see another one. Part of me hopes I do, but a bigger part hopes I never experience anything like that again. I've been hesitating to share this for almost 20 years now, but I need to get this off my chest. Back in 2004, I experienced something in the woods of northern Michigan that completely changed my perspective on what might be out there. My hunting buddy Mark and I had been going to this particular spot for years. It was this remote hillside area about 2 hours from civilization, perfect for deer hunting. We knew every trail, every creek, and every ridge like the backs of our hands. Or at least, we thought we did. It was early November, right in the peak of deer season. The weather that morning was unusually warm for that time of year, probably in the mid-50s, which had us both feeling a bit off about our prospects. We'd driven up before dawn, parked the truck at our usual spot, and hiked about 45 minutes to our favorite ridge. The sun was just starting to peek through the trees when we got to our spots, maybe around 6:45 a.m. The first few hours were quiet, too quiet, honestly. Usually, you'd hear squirrels rustling through leaves, birds calling, all that normal forest stuff. But that morning, everything felt muted, like the woods were holding their breath. I remember checking my watch constantly, fighting the urge to radio Mark and ask if he was seeing anything. We always maintained radio silence during morning hunts to avoid spooking the deer. Around 10:30 a.m., everything changed. I was taking a sip of coffee from my thermos when I heard it, this sound that I still can't properly describe. It was like a cross between a woman screaming and a bear's roar, but wrong. It had this guttural quality that made the hair on my neck stand up, and it seemed to echo off the hills in a way that natural sounds just don't. The worst part was how it shifted pitch halfway through, dropping into this deep growl that you could feel in your chest. I nearly dropped my thermos. My hands were shaking so bad I had to set it down carefully on the platform of my tree stand. The sound came again, closer this time, and I could swear it had a warning tone to it, like when you accidentally get too close to a mama bear's cubs. But this was different. This felt intelligent, like whatever made that sound was telling us specifically to get out. I grabbed my radio. Protocol be damned. "Mark, you hearing this?" I whispered. There was a long pause before his response came through, crackling with static. "Yeah, what the hell is that?" We decided to stay put until noon. Neither of us wanted to climb down and walk through the woods with that thing out there. The sound came 2 more times over the next hour, each time from a different direction, like it was circling us. The local wildlife seemed to have vanished entirely. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. When we finally met up at our designated spot, Mark was as pale as I've ever seen him. We quickly packed up and started heading back to the truck, walking much faster than usual. That's when I saw it. About 80 yards ahead, through a gap in the trees, something moved. At first I thought it was another hunter in camo gear, but the proportions were all wrong. This thing was massive. I'd guess around 7, 8 feet tall, but it was the width that really got me. Its shoulders must have been twice as broad as mine, and I'm not a small guy. The weird thing was, like you mentioned about not having a neck, that detail stuck with me too. Its head seemed to sit directly on its shoulders, giving it this hulking, primitive appearance. It was moving fast, really fast, weaving between the trees with an unnatural grace for something its size. The way it moved. It wasn't running exactly, more like these long, fluid strides that covered way more ground than should have been possible. It seemed to be deliberately keeping trees between us and it, but I got a clear enough look to see that what I initially thought was camo gear was actually some kind of mottled, dark coloring on its body. Mark saw it too. He grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises. We froze in place, barely breathing. The thing disappeared behind a thick stand of pines, and we heard that sound again, quieter this time, almost like a grumble, but definitely the same voice. We practically ran back to the truck. Neither of us spoke until we were on the main road, hands still shaking as I fumbled with the keys. Mark finally broke the silence. "We're never talking about this to anyone, right?" I agreed at the time, but here I am, finally sharing it. The thing that really gets me, even now, is how deliberate it all felt. This wasn't some animal acting on instinct. Whatever we encountered that day was intelligent enough to want to warn us off its territory without directly confronting us. It knew exactly what it was doing, maintaining just enough distance to stay partially hidden while making sure we knew it was there. We never went back to that spot. Never even discussed it again until about a year ago when Mark called me late one night, pretty drunk, asking if I still remembered that day. Of course I did. How could I forget? He confessed he'd been having nightmares about it recently, said he kept hearing that sound in his dreams. I've spent countless hours researching similar encounters since then, trying to make sense of what we experienced. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, studied local folklore, even reached out to a few cryptozoologists, though I've never told them my story. Nothing quite matches what we saw that day. The rational part of my brain keeps trying to explain it away. Maybe it was a bear walking upright. Maybe the weird light of that morning played tricks on our eyes. But then I remember that sound, that deliberate way it moved, how it seemed to know exactly how to stay just out of clear sight. And I know deep down that we encountered something that science hasn't explained yet. I still hunt, but never alone anymore, and never in areas that remote. Sometimes when I'm in the woods, I catch myself scanning the trees, listening for that distinctive sound. Part of me hopes I'll never hear it again, but another part wishes I could go back with a camera, get proof of what we saw. But then I remember the primal fear I felt that day, the way that creature moved with such purpose, and I know I'm better off staying away. This is the first time I've written this all down. It feels both terrifying and relieving to finally share it. I know how it sounds. Believe me, if someone had told me this story before it happened to me, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. But I know what I saw, what I heard. That day changed something in me. There are things in this world we don't understand, things that don't want to be understood. Sometimes I think they just want to be left alone, and that sound we heard was just their way of telling us we weren't welcome there. What happened that night in 2019 completely changed how I view the world, and honestly, I still get chills thinking about it. My wife Sarah and I haven't told many people about this. Who would believe us anyway? But I need to tell someone who might understand. We own this small cabin by Lake Crescent in Washington State. Nothing fancy, just a cozy 2-bedroom place about 50 yards from the water's edge, surrounded by dense forest. We'd go there most weekends to unwind, bring our dogs, 2 German shepherds, Max and Luna, do some fishing, and just escape the city life. The place had always felt safe, peaceful even. Until that night in late October. It was around 8:30 p.m., and we were just settling in for the evening. Sarah was reading on the couch while I was cleaning up after dinner. Max and Luna were sprawled out on their beds near the fireplace. Typical evening routine. The weather had been awful all day, with this heavy mist hanging over the lake and a constant drizzle that made everything feel damp and gloomy. We'd barely left the cabin all day because of it. That's when we heard the first knock. Not like someone politely knocking on the door. This was more like someone taking their fist and slamming it against the side of the cabin. The whole wall seemed to vibrate. My first thought was that maybe a branch had fallen, but then it happened again and again. 3 distinct knocks, each one powerful enough to make the windows rattle. Here's where things got weird. Our dogs, who usually go absolutely nuts at the slightest noise outside, just froze. I mean completely still, ears pulled back, tails tucked. I'd never seen them act like that before. Max is usually our tough guy, always ready to protect us, but he just slunk behind the couch, whimpering. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. Sarah had already jumped up from the couch and was standing next to me in the kitchen. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. Before I could answer, we heard heavy footsteps crunching through the gravel outside, moving toward the side of the cabin where we had a big window. The security light hadn't kicked on yet, which was strange because it usually detected any movement out there. That's when the knocking started again, this time on the window itself. 2 slow, deliberate knocks. I still remember the sound. It wasn't like knuckles on glass. It was duller, like something padded hitting the window. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, one of those heavy-duty ones that could probably double as a weapon if needed. Sarah was clutching my arm so tight it hurt. We both slowly moved toward the window, and that's when we saw it. I know how this is going to sound, but I swear on everything I hold dear that what I'm about to describe is exactly what we saw. Standing there, partially illuminated by the light from inside our cabin, was this enormous figure. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It was covered in dark, matted fur that looked soaked from the rain. But it wasn't like any bear I'd ever seen. Its proportions were all wrong. It was standing completely upright, with these incredibly long arms that hung down past its knees. The thing that keeps me up at night even now was its face. It was so human-like, but not human at the same time. The eyes were set deep under a prominent brow ridge, and they reflected the light from inside the cabin with this reddish-orange glow. Its nose was wide and flat, and the jaw was massive, but it had this expression of what I can only describe as curiosity. It was studying us just as much as we were studying it. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds or so, we just stood there, staring at each other through the window. It didn't make any aggressive moves, but it didn't back away either. It just watched. Then it slowly raised one of its massive hands and placed it flat against the window. The hand alone was bigger than my entire head. That's when Sarah screamed. Not a horror movie scream, but this choked, terrified sound that seemed to snap both of us out of our frozen state. The creature jerked back at the noise, and in that movement, the security light finally kicked on, flooding the side yard with bright light. I wish I could say the light made things better, made us realize it was just a bear or someone in a costume, but no, in that harsh white light, we could see everything in perfect detail, the way its muscles moved under the fur, the steam rising from its body in the cold air, the way its fingers, yes, fingers, not claws, curled slightly as it pulled its hand back from the window. "We need to get out of here," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "Right now." I nodded, trying to keep my eyes on the creature while fumbling in my pocket for the car keys. Our SUV was parked about 30 yards away, near the front of the cabin. We'd have to make a run for it. The creature was still standing there, but it had taken a step back from the window. Its head was cocked slightly to one side, like it was trying to figure out what we were doing. That's when I noticed something else. There was this smell starting to seep into the cabin. It's hard to describe, like wet dog mixed with something musty and wild, but there was also this weird, sweet undertone to it, almost like rotting fruit. We had a plan, simple but terrifying. Grab the dogs, run to the car, get the hell out. The dogs were still cowering behind the couch, which was completely out of character for them. These were dogs that would chase bears away from our trash cans, but whatever this thing was, had them absolutely terrified. I counted down quietly to Sarah. 3, 2, 1. We grabbed the dogs by their collars. They came willingly, thankfully, and made a break for the front door. I fumbled with the lock for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. The whole time I was expecting to feel something grab me from behind. We burst out the front door and ran for the car. I could hear heavy footsteps circling around the side of the cabin, coming our way. Sarah was already at the passenger side with Luna, and I practically threw Max into the back seat before jumping into the driver's seat. The engine started on the first try, thank God, and I threw it into reverse just as the creature emerged from around the corner of the cabin. In the headlights, it looked even bigger than before. It just stood there, watching us leave. It didn't chase us or make any aggressive moves. As we backed up onto the gravel road, I could see it in the rear-view mirror, still standing in front of our cabin, getting smaller and smaller until we turned a corner and it disappeared from view. We drove straight home that night, about 3 hours away. Neither of us said much during the drive. What could we say? We'd just seen something that wasn't supposed to exist. The dogs stayed huddled in the back seat, occasionally whimpering but mostly just trembling. We went back the next day, in broad daylight, and we weren't alone. I convinced my brother to come with us, and we brought a gun, just in case. The creature was long gone, but it had left evidence behind. There were these massive depressions in the gravel where it had stood, but no clear footprints. The ground was too hard. We found tufts of dark hair caught on the rough wood siding of the cabin, which I collected but didn't know what to do with. The window where it had placed its hand had these smudge marks on it, huge ones, way bigger than any human hand could make. The weirdest thing we found was behind the cabin. There was this small clearing there, and in the middle of it was a pile of freshly broken branches, arranged in an X pattern. It looked deliberate, like some kind of marker or sign. None of us wanted to get too close to it. That was 5 years ago. We still own the cabin, but we rarely go there anymore. When we do, we never stay overnight. The dogs still won't go near the place. They start acting up as soon as we turn onto the gravel road leading to it. We've heard stories from other people in the area about strange noises in the woods, about feeling watched, about finding similar branch arrangements in the forest. But no one else has reported seeing what we saw that night. I know what people will think when they read this. Trust me, if someone had told me this story 5 years ago, I would have thought they were making it up or had seen a bear and let their imagination run wild. But I know what I saw. Sarah knows what she saw. And our dogs, well, they knew something too. I've spent countless hours researching similar encounters, looking at blurry photos and videos, reading witness accounts. Some of them sound a lot like what we experienced. That same sense of curiosity from the creature, that same lack of aggression despite its intimidating size. The knocking, the branch arrangements, the way dogs react to their presence. It all fits a pattern that's been reported for decades. I don't know if it was what people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever other name it goes by. All I know is that something intelligent and unknown was watching us through our window that night. Something that walked on 2 legs, that used its hands with purpose, that showed clear signs of reasoning and curiosity. Something that shouldn't exist according to science, but absolutely does exist according to my own eyes. I still have nightmares about those eyes looking in through our window, about that massive hand pressed against the glass, about what might have happened if we'd stayed there any longer. But mostly, I think about how much else might be out there in the woods that we don't know about. How many other creatures might be watching us from the shadows, just as curious about us as we are about them. We're selling the cabin next spring. We've tried to convince ourselves to keep it, to get past that night, but we can't. Every time we're there, every snapping twig or rustling bush makes us freeze. Every shadow outside the windows could be that figure coming back. It's not worth the stress anymore. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, sometimes I have trouble believing it myself. But I needed to share it. Maybe someone else out there has seen something similar and is afraid to talk about it. Maybe knowing they're not alone will help them cope with it better than I have. All I know is that I'll never look at the woods the same way again. And if you're ever alone in a cabin in the Pacific Northwest and you hear heavy knocking on your walls, don't go look out the window. Just get in your car and drive away. Trust me on this one. That's all. What happened to me in the Cascade Mountains back in 2004 has haunted me ever since, and I still get goosebumps every time I think about it. I'm not the type who believes in crazy stuff. I work in IT, live a pretty normal life in Seattle, and generally try to approach things logically. But what I experienced that summer defied any rational explanation I could come up with. I used to love solo hiking and camping, did it almost every weekend when the weather was good. There was this particular trail about 3 hours from Seattle that I'd hit up regularly. It was secluded enough that you'd rarely run into other hikers, but not so remote that it felt dangerous. At least, that's what I thought before that day in late August 2004. I remember the weather was perfect that morning. Clear skies, around 65 degrees, just a light breeze. I'd packed my usual gear, tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 2 days, water filter, the basics. Started the hike around 7 a.m., planning to camp overnight at this small clearing I knew about 6 miles up the trail. I'd done this exact trip probably a dozen times before. The first few hours were completely normal. I was making good time, stopping occasionally to take pictures or drink some water. It wasn't until around 10:30 a.m. that something felt off. You know that feeling when you're alone but suddenly feel like you're being watched? It was like that, but way more intense. I stopped to catch my breath and scan the tree line. That's when I saw it for the first time. This weird orange-brown figure standing between 2 pine trees maybe 200 feet away. At first I thought it was another hiker wearing one of those bright orange safety vests, but something about the proportions was wrong. This thing was tall, like way too tall to be a person, and it was just standing there, completely still, watching me. My heart started racing, but I tried to stay calm. I told myself it was probably just a weird-looking tree or my eyes playing tricks on me. I took my phone out to take a picture, but by the time I got the camera app open, whatever it was had disappeared. I kept hiking, but that feeling of being watched didn't go away. Every few minutes I'd hear something, branches snapping or leaves rustling, but always just far enough away that I couldn't get a good look at what was causing it. The sounds seemed to be keeping pace with me, staying at roughly the same distance. Around noon, things escalated. I had stopped to eat lunch on this fallen log when I heard a loud crack from the forest to my left. Before I could even turn my head, something whizzed past me and hit a tree about 10 feet away. It was a branch, a pretty big one, maybe 3 feet long. There's no way it just fell naturally at that angle. Something had thrown it. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely pack up my lunch. I started walking faster, constantly looking over my shoulder. The sounds followed me. More branches and even some rocks started landing near me, never hitting me directly but close enough to make it clear this wasn't random. Then I saw it again. This time it was closer, maybe 100 feet away, partially hidden behind a large cedar tree. The orange-brown color was definitely fur, not clothing. The height, God, it must have been at least 8 feet tall. The way it moved wasn't quite human. There was something about its posture that was just wrong, like its arms were too long and its shoulders too wide. I'm not ashamed to admit I panicked. I started running down the trail, my heavy backpack bouncing painfully against my spine. The sounds of movement in the forest kept pace with me easily. Whatever this thing was, it could move through dense forest as fast as I could run on a clear trail. After maybe half a mile of running, I had to stop. I was completely out of breath, and my chest felt like it was going to explode. That's when I heard it. This deep, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl, but definitely wasn't human either. It came from somewhere off to my right, and it was close, maybe 50 feet away. I turned slowly toward the sound. There it was, standing in a small clearing. In broad daylight, I could see it clearly now. The orange-brown fur covered its entire body. Its face was almost human-like, but not quite. The brow ridge was massive, and its eyes... I'll never forget those eyes. They weren't animal eyes, but they weren't human either. There was intelligence there, and something else I couldn't identify. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it took a step toward me. I don't remember consciously deciding to run. My body just moved on its own. I sprinted down that trail faster than I've ever run in my life. I could hear it moving through the forest parallel to me, branches snapping and undergrowth crushing under its weight. I ran until my legs gave out. When I finally stopped, the forest was completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing and pounding heart. I waited, straining to hear any sign of movement, but there was nothing. After about 15 minutes of this terrible silence, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A series of heavy footsteps moving away from me, deeper into the forest. They were slow, deliberate steps, like whatever it was wanted me to hear it leaving. I didn't wait around to see if it would come back. I walked as fast as I could back to my car, constantly checking over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched stayed with me the whole way, but I didn't see the creature again. When I finally reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. As I was pulling out of the parking area, I glanced in my rear-view mirror. There, at the edge of the tree line, I saw that orange-brown figure one last time. It just stood there, watching me leave. I've never gone back to that trail. Haven't done any solo hiking since then either. I tried reporting it to the park rangers, but I could tell they didn't believe me. I've spent countless hours researching similar encounters in that area, and while I've found a few reports that sound similar, none of them quite match what I experienced. The thing that still bothers me the most isn't just that I saw something impossible. It's that whatever it was seemed to be playing with me. The thrown branches never hit me directly. It could have easily caught me when I was running. Something that big moving that easily through the forest definitely could have. But it didn't. It just followed me, watched me, like it was studying my reactions. I still live in Seattle, still work my IT job, still try to live a normal life. But I can't look at the mountains the same way anymore. Every time I drive past them, I think about what might be out there, watching and waiting. Sometimes at night, I dream about those eyes, that intelligence that was definitely not human, but undeniably real. I know how this story sounds. If someone had told it to me before 2004, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. But I know what I saw. That thing was real, and it was not just some guy in a suit or a bear or any other explanation people have tried to give me. There are things in those mountains that we don't understand, and sometimes they decide to make themselves known. The strangest part, sometimes I catch myself missing it. That feeling of encountering something truly unknown, something that shattered my understanding of what's possible. But then I remember those eyes, that rumbling sound, and the way it moved through the forest like it owned it. And I know I made the right choice, never going back. I still have the backpack I was wearing that day. There's a tear in it from where I snagged it on a branch while running. Sometimes I look at that tear and touch it, just to remind myself that it really happened, that I'm not crazy. Whatever that thing was, it changed my life forever. I just hope I never see it again. I was 32 at the time, and hunting was my life. Every season, me and my buddies Tom, Mike, and Steve would head out to different spots in Missouri. We weren't weekend warriors. We knew what we were doing. Between the 4 of us, we had nearly 60 years of hunting experience. We'd tracked deer through every kind of terrain you could imagine, spent countless nights in the wilderness, and thought we'd seen it all. Man, were we wrong. That October was unusually warm. We'd heard about this promising spot deep in the Ozarks from another hunter at the local supply store. Said there was great deer activity there, but it was pretty remote. Had to hike about 4 miles off the main trail to reach it. We packed our gear like we always did. Rifles, ammo, camping equipment, enough supplies for 3 days. The usual stuff. The hike-in was rough. The trail hadn't been maintained in years, and we had to machete our way through some parts. By late afternoon, we found a decent clearing to set up camp. It was perfect elevated ground, good visibility, close to a small stream. We got the tents up and started preparing for the evening hunt. The first weird thing I noticed was the silence. Anyone who spent time in the woods knows they're never truly quiet. There's always something, birds, insects, small animals rustling around. But as the sun started setting, everything just stopped. Like someone had hit the mute button on the forest. Tom noticed it too, and gave me this look that said he wasn't comfortable. We decided to turn in early, planning to be up before dawn for the morning hunt. Must have been around 1 a.m. when I heard it. At first I thought I was dreaming, but then it came again, this scream that made my blood run cold. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, and believe me, I know what mountain lions, bears, and coyotes sound like. This was different. It started low, almost like a human moan, then rose to this high-pitched shriek that seemed to go on forever. It echoed through the mountains, making it impossible to tell which direction it came from. Mike was already awake in our tent, and I could hear movement from Tom and Steve's tent too. "What the hell was that?" Mike whispered. Before I could answer, we heard it again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, and we all emerged from our tents. The moon was nearly full, but the trees created these deep shadows that seemed to move. The air felt heavy, like right before a storm, but the sky was clear. That's when Steve pointed to something on the ground near the edge of our camp. We walked over, and I swear my heart stopped for a second. There, pressed deep into the soft earth, was a footprint unlike anything I'd seen in my decades of hunting. It had to be at least 16 inches long and incredibly wide. The impression was so deep that whatever made it must have weighed hundreds of pounds. But what really got to me was how human-like it looked. 5 toes, an arch, a heel, just scaled up to an impossible size. We found a line of these prints leading into the denser part of the forest. They were fresh. The displaced soil hadn't even dried completely. Whatever made them was still around. Tom wanted to pack up and leave right then, but it was the middle of the night, and we had no idea where this thing was. We decided to stay together, keep the fire going, and maintain a watch rotation until dawn. I took the first shift with Mike. For about an hour, nothing happened except for that oppressive silence. Then we started hearing the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving through the forest around our camp. Sometimes they'd stop for a while, then start again from a different direction. It was toying with us. Around 3 a.m. during Steve and Tom's watch, I was lying in my tent when I heard Steve's sharp intake of breath. I grabbed my rifle and was outside in seconds. Steve was pointing his flashlight at the tree line, his hand shaking so bad the beam was dancing all over the place. That's when I saw it. A shadow moved between 2 large oaks about 50 yards from camp. It was huge, had to be at least 8 feet tall. The moonlight caught its silhouette for just a moment, showing a massive, broad-shouldered figure covered in what looked like dark fur. It moved with this weird smoothness, like it knew exactly how to stay just out of the light. The screaming started again, but this time it was right there, coming from that shadow. The sound hit us like a physical force. I've been hunting my whole life, been in some scary situations, but nothing had ever made me feel so completely, utterly helpless. We were the prey now. For the next 2 hours, this thing circled our camp. Sometimes we'd catch glimpses, a massive arm here, the flash of eyes reflecting our flashlights there. The footsteps would get closer, then fade away. That scream would pierce the night at random intervals, keeping us on edge. We had our rifles ready, but none of us fired. Something in our gut told us that would only make things worse. As the sky started to lighten, the activity suddenly stopped. The forest was still dead quiet, but the footsteps and screams ceased. When the sun finally rose, we practically ran through our camp breakdown. Nobody wanted to investigate the prints in daylight. We just wanted out. The hike back was a blur. We made it in record time, barely speaking a word until we reached our trucks. That's when Tom finally said what we were all thinking. "We're never talking about this to anyone." And we didn't, for years. Tom, Mike, and Steve have all moved away from Missouri now. We still keep in touch, but we never discuss that night. Sometimes I'll catch a news story about strange sounds in the Ozarks, or see a blurry photo someone took in the woods, and that feeling comes rushing back. I still hunt, but never in that part of the Ozarks. Something's out there in those mountains, something that shouldn't exist, but does. I don't need proof. I know what I saw, what I heard, that scream. I still hear it in my dreams sometimes. It's the sound of something ancient, something that the woods have kept hidden for good reason. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened that night. Could have been bears, mountain lions, even some elaborate prank. But deep down, I know better. There are things in this world we're not meant to understand, things that remind us we're not always at the top of the food chain. Whatever was in those woods that night was one of them. The older I get, the more I think about leaving some kind of record of what happened. Not for attention or fame. God knows I don't want either. But because maybe someone else will experience something similar and need to know they're not crazy. Those mountains hold secrets, and sometimes they let us catch a glimpse of them, whether we want to or not. I still have the photos we took of the campsite the next morning, though they don't show much, just our hastily packed gear and some trampled ground. The footprints don't show up well in the pictures, almost like they were meant to stay hidden. Maybe that's for the best. Some things are better left as memories, no matter how much they haunt us. I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but what happened that winter in 1992 still haunts me to this day. We'd moved to our home near Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina just 6 months before everything started. My husband Tom had gotten a good job at the lumber mill in Brevard, and with 2 kids under 10, we thought the quiet mountain life would be perfect for our family. The first strange thing I noticed was the missing firewood. Living next to the forest meant we had plenty of wood for the winter, and Tom would spend his weekends chopping and stacking it neatly against our shed. At first, I thought maybe Tom had been using more than usual because of the harsh winter, but when I mentioned it to him one morning over coffee, he looked confused. "I haven't touched the east stack in weeks," he said. That's when we started paying attention. Every few days, a significant portion of our firewood would vanish, not scattered or knocked over, just gone, as if someone had carefully selected certain pieces and carried them away. We might have blamed teenagers or neighbors if we weren't so isolated. Our closest neighbor was 3 miles down the road. The snow that winter was unusually heavy for North Carolina, and that's what made the footprints impossible to ignore. I first spotted them one morning while getting the kids ready for school. Looking out the kitchen window, I froze. There, in the fresh snow around our woodpile, were the biggest footprints I'd ever seen. They were clearly bipedal, whatever made them walked on 2 legs, but they were at least 16 inches long and incredibly wide. The stride length between each print was massive, easily twice what a normal person's would be. I called Tom over, and we stood there studying them. He tried to rationalize it, maybe someone wearing snowshoes. But these weren't snowshoe prints. They showed clear toe impressions, almost like a giant bare foot, but broader and with slightly different proportions than a human foot. The kids were excited, thinking it was some kind of game, but Tom and I exchanged worried glances. That night, we heard it for the first time. We were all in bed when a deep, guttural sound echoed through the trees. It wasn't like any animal I knew, not a bear's growl or a wolf's howl. It was lower, almost like someone trying to talk underwater, but amplified. The sound made the windows vibrate slightly. Our dogs, Max and Lady, who usually barked at every squirrel and rabbit, were dead silent, huddled together under our front porch, refusing to come inside. The sounds continued sporadically over the next few weeks. Sometimes we'd hear wood cracking deep in the forest, like something massive was moving through the trees. The kids started having trouble sleeping, and honestly, so did I. The worst part was the constant feeling of being watched. I'd be hanging laundry or getting into my car, and the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up. I'd look toward the tree line, and though I never saw anything clearly, I'd sometimes catch a glimpse of movement, like something massive shifting in the shadows. But everything came to a head on February 12th. I remember the date because it was the night before Valentine's Day, and I'd been up late wrapping small gifts for the kids. It was around 2 a.m., and the moon was nearly full, reflecting off the snow and creating that weird blue-white brightness that winter nights sometimes have. I was about to head to bed when I heard the familiar sound of wood being moved outside. Instead of waking Tom, I went to the kitchen window. What I saw there still makes my hands shake when I think about it. Standing at our woodpile, partially illuminated by the moonlight, was the largest figure I'd ever seen. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark matted fur that looked almost brown-black in the moonlight. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, maybe twice the width of a large man's. The creature was methodically selecting pieces of firewood, picking them up with hands that looked disturbingly similar to human hands, just massive. It would examine each piece before either setting it aside or adding it to what looked like a pile it was creating. The movement was deliberate, almost careful. This wasn't some mindless animal. There was intelligence in its actions. I stood there, completely frozen, afraid that any movement would alert it to my presence. That's when Max and Lady, who had been unusually quiet lately, suddenly erupted into frenzied barking from inside the house. The creature's head snapped up, and for a brief moment it looked directly at the window where I stood. Its eyes caught the moonlight, reflecting with an amber glow that reminded me of a cat's eyes, but larger. The face was... I still struggled to describe it. It was somewhere between ape and human, with a pronounced brow ridge and a wider, flatter nose than a human's. The moment lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then, with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large, it turned and moved into the forest. It didn't crash through the underbrush like you might expect. It moved with an eerie grace, seemingly disappearing between one blink and the next. All that remained were its footprints in the snow and the scattered pieces of firewood it had been sorting. Tom was awake by then, brought downstairs by the dog's barking. We stood in the kitchen, looking at the evidence of what had just happened. The footprints were identical to the ones we'd been seeing for weeks. We followed them to the edge of our property, where they disappeared into the dense forest. The strange thing is, after that night, everything stopped. The woods stopped disappearing, the sounds ceased, and even that feeling of being watched gradually faded. We stayed in that house for another 5 years before Tom got transferred to Georgia, and we never had another incident like that winter. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened. I've read about bears, studied local wildlife, and even looked into the history of the area. Nothing quite explains what we experienced. The locals we eventually talked to had their own stories they were hesitant to share until we shared ours. Tales of similar encounters going back generations, always in the winter months, always involving missing firewood or food. Sometimes I wonder if it was studying us as much as we were trying to understand it. The careful way it selected the firewood, the fact it never tried to break into our home or harm us. It seemed more like a neighbor borrowing supplies than a wild animal. To this day, I can't drive past a woodpile without remembering that figure in the moonlight, and wondering if somewhere in the forests of North Carolina it's still there, watching and waiting for the next winter. My buddy Jack and I had been planning this fishing trip for months. We'd found this secluded spot in the Rockies, about 4 hours north of Calgary, the kind of place you don't find on regular maps, where the only sounds are the wind through the pines and your own thoughts. We'd packed everything we needed for a week of peaceful fishing. Our tent, plenty of supplies, fishing gear, and enough coffee to keep us warm during those chilly mountain mornings. Looking back, I wish we'd brought a camera, but who could have known what we'd encounter out there? The drive up was uneventful. We took Jack's old Ford pickup as far as the logging road would allow, then hiked the last 2 miles with our gear. The lake was exactly what we'd hoped for. Crystal clear water surrounded by dense forest, with the Rockies towering in the background. Perfect fishing conditions, or so we thought. The first day was everything we'd dreamed of. We caught several decent-sized trout, set up camp about 50 feet from the shoreline, and spent the evening drinking beer and swapping stories by the fire. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. That's when things started feeling different. It began with this overwhelming silence. I know that sounds strange. Silence should be normal in the wilderness, right? But this was different. It was like someone had hit the mute button on the entire forest. No bird calls, no insects chirping, nothing. Jack noticed it too. I could tell by the way he kept looking over his shoulder at the tree line. That first night, around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of branches breaking. Not small twigs, mind you, but the thick kind that make that distinctive crack when something heavy steps on them. The footsteps seemed to circle our camp, always staying just far enough in the darkness that we couldn't see what was making them. Jack was awake too. I could feel him tensing up in his sleeping bag. "You hearing this?" he whispered. "Yeah," was all I could manage to say back. Whatever it was, it had to be big. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like it was trying to be quiet but couldn't quite manage it due to its size. We lay there for what felt like hours, barely breathing, until the sounds finally stopped with the first light of dawn. The next morning, we tried to rationalize it. Could have been a bear, we told ourselves, though deep down we knew bears don't move like that. We decided to check the area around our camp and found something that made my blood run cold. Near the lake's edge, pressed deep into the mud, were footprints. Not bear prints, not moose prints. These were feet, human-like feet, but massive, easily 16 inches long. The stride length between them was incredible, maybe 6 feet apart. I'd worked as a park ranger for a few years in my 20s, and I'd seen all kinds of animal tracks. These weren't anything I'd encountered before. They were fresh too, the water still seeping into the depressions. Jack took one look at them, and his face went white. We spent that day fishing, but our hearts weren't in it. Every few minutes one of us would scan the tree line. The forest felt hostile now, like we were being watched. You know that feeling when you're alone but suddenly realize someone's staring at you? It was like that, but 100 times worse. The second night was quieter, but somehow that made it worse. The silence was so complete it felt like a physical presence. We kept our fire burning higher than necessary, neither of us willing to admit we were scared. Around midnight, Jack nudged me and pointed toward the tree line. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards away, standing perfectly still between 2 large pines, was a figure. In the dim moonlight, I could make out its basic shape. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a massive chest. It was too dark to see details, but I could tell it was covered in dark hair. The thing that haunts me most was how it stood, perfectly upright, like a human, but impossibly tall and wide. It just watched us, didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, observing. I don't know how long we stared at each other. Could have been minutes or hours. My flashlight was right next to me, but something in my gut told me not to shine it in that direction. Some primal instinct warned me that I really didn't want to see this thing clearly. Jack started quietly packing up our essential gear. I didn't even need to ask why. We both knew we weren't staying another night. The figure remained motionless as we worked, but I swear I could feel its eyes following our every move. When we finally had our basics packed, we made a break for it. Didn't even bother taking down the tent properly, just grabbed our backpacks and started walking quickly toward the trail. Not running. Something told us running would be a very bad idea. The moon was bright enough to light our way, and we didn't dare use our flashlights. The whole 2-mile hike back to the truck, we could hear it paralleling us in the woods. Heavy footsteps, branches breaking, but always just out of sight. Sometimes it would get closer and we'd freeze, then it would back off again. It felt like it was escorting us out of its territory. We reached the truck around 3 a.m. Only when we were inside with the doors locked and the engine running did we finally turn on some lights. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement at the forest's edge, something dark receding into the trees, but it was too quick to make out clearly. The drive home was silent. What could we say? We'd both seen it, both knew what we'd experienced, but putting it into words seemed impossible. When we got back to Calgary, we went our separate ways and didn't talk about it for months. Jack moved to Ontario the following year, but we still keep in touch. Sometimes, late at night, one of us will call the other, and we'll talk around what happened, never quite addressing it directly. We've never gone fishing together again. I've spent countless hours researching what we might have encountered. I've read about similar experiences in the area, looked at fuzzy photographs, and studied Native American legends. But nothing quite captures what we experienced that night. The thing that strikes me most, looking back, is the intelligence behind it all. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. The way it watched us, how it systematically drove us out of its territory without ever actually threatening us. There was purpose there, planning, intelligence. I've never gone back to that lake. I've been invited on other fishing trips in the Rockies, but I always find an excuse not to go. The few times I've gone hiking in the mountains since then, I stick to popular trails and never stay overnight. Some people have suggested we imagined it all, that fear and isolation played tricks on our minds. But those footprints were real. That figure was real. And sometimes, On quiet nights when I can't sleep, I remember how it felt to be watched by something that shouldn't exist, something that seemed to exist in that grey area between the world we know and something else entirely. I don't expect everyone to believe this story. Hell, if someone had told me this before it happened, I probably wouldn't have believed it either. But I know what we saw, and I know that somewhere up there in the Rockies, around that silent lake, something is still watching, waiting, protecting its territory from intruders like us. The fishing gear we left behind, it's still there as far as I know. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has found that spot, if they've experienced what we did. If you're ever hiking in the Rockies and come across an old weather-beaten tent near a pristine lake, my advice would be to turn around and leave. Some places aren't meant for us to visit, and some mysteries are better left unexplored. My wife Sarah and I had just moved to a small town in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. We were both in our early 30s, and after years of living in Sacramento, we wanted something quieter, closer to nature. We found this perfect little house backing up to the national forest. Nothing fancy, just a simple 2-bedroom with a big yard. The previous owners even left their old chicken coop, which we converted into a workshop. Our dogs, Max and Luna, absolutely loved it there. Max was this big, goofy German Shepherd mix we'd had since he was a puppy, and Luna was a black lab we'd rescued a few years back. They had about an acre to run around in, and they'd spend hours chasing squirrels and sniffing every corner of that property. It was mid-July, one of those sticky summer nights where the heat just refuses to let up, even after dark. Sarah and I were inside watching TV with the AC running. Must have been around 10:30 p.m. The dogs were outside like usual. We had a doggy door, and they liked to patrol the yard at night, keeping watch for raccoons and deer. That's when everything changed. The barking started suddenly. Not their usual, hey, there's a deer bark, or even their aggressive, there's someone at the door bark. This was different. I'd never heard them sound like that before. It was frantic, almost panicked. I muted the TV and looked at Sarah. "Something's wrong," she said, and I could hear the worry in her voice. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and went to the back door. The security light had kicked on, casting harsh shadows across the yard. Max and Luna were both standing rigid at the tree line, about 50 feet from the house, hackles raised, barking non-stop at the darkness beyond our property. "Max, Luna, come here," I called out. Nothing. They wouldn't budge. They just kept barking, and now I could see they were shaking. These weren't small dogs. Max was 90 pounds of muscle, and I'd seen him chase off a black bear before. But something had them absolutely terrified. I stepped out onto the back porch, and that's when I felt it. This oppressive feeling of wrongness. You know that feeling when you're alone in a parking garage late at night, and you're sure someone's watching you? It was like that, but 100 times worse. The air felt heavy, thick with tension. Sarah joined me on the porch. "What's going on with them?" she whispered. Before I could answer, we heard it, this low, guttural sound coming from the woods. It wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a moan. It was deeper than any animal I'd ever heard, and it had this almost human quality to it that made my skin crawl. Then came the knocking, 3 sharp impacts, like someone hitting a tree trunk with a baseball bat. Thud, thud, thud. It echoed through the trees, and the dog's barking kicked up another notch. "Get the dogs inside, now," I said. Sarah started calling them, clapping her hands, anything to get their attention. They wouldn't move. I had to walk out into the yard and physically grab their collars to drag them back. They fought me the whole way, still barking at the tree line. Just as we got to the porch, Sarah grabbed my arm. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Look." I followed her gaze to the edge of our property, where the yard met the forest. There, partially illuminated by our security light, was something I still struggle to explain. A figure, massive, had to be at least 8 feet tall, was moving between the trees. It was dark, but I could make out broad shoulders, covered in what looked like thick, matted fur. It moved with this weird, fluid grace that was just wrong. Nothing that big should be able to move that quietly. We rushed inside, locked every door and window, and pulled all the blinds. The dogs were still going crazy, running from window to window, growling and barking. That knocking sound continued, moving around the perimeter of our property. Sometimes it would stop for a few minutes, then start up again from a different direction. The worst part was when it would sync up with this deep, rhythmic moaning, like someone was trying to communicate. Around midnight, things escalated. We heard something on the back deck, heavy footsteps that made the wooden boards creak. Max and Luna lost it completely, barking and throwing themselves at the back door. Sarah was crying quietly, holding onto my arm. I had my phone in one hand, 911 already dialed, but not sent. What would I even say? Then came the smell. Even through the closed windows, this overwhelming stench of wet fur and something else, something rotten and musty, like old meat mixed with dirt. It was so strong it made my eyes water. The footsteps moved to the side of the house, right under our bedroom window. There was a scraping sound, like huge fingers dragging across the siding. I swear I could hear breathing, deep, heavy breaths that didn't sound quite human or animal. We spent the entire night in the living room, lights on, dogs pacing and growling. Neither of us slept. The knocking and movement continued until about 4 a.m., when everything suddenly went quiet. The dogs finally settled down around sunrise. When we ventured outside the next morning, the evidence was everywhere. Deep footprints in the soft earth near the trees, huge prints, at least 16 inches long. They weren't bear tracks. I know what those look like. These were eerily human-shaped, just massive. Several branches were broken off the trees at heights I couldn't reach, even jumping. There were tufts of coarse, dark brown hair caught in the bark of multiple trees. But the most disturbing thing was the chicken coop-turned-workshop. Something had ripped the hasp clean off the door. Inside, nothing was stolen or seriously damaged, but everything had been touched, moved, examined. Tools were arranged in weird patterns on the workbench. It was like whatever it was had been curious. We found similar footprints and broken branches for about a week afterward, always fresh in the morning. But we never saw the creature again. The dogs refused to go out after dark for months. We ended up moving away the following year. Sarah couldn't handle living there anymore, and honestly, neither could I. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened that night. I've read every article I could find about bears, mountain lions, and other local wildlife. Nothing fits. The height, the movement, the sounds, the intelligence it displayed, it all points to something else, something that shouldn't exist. I've heard all the Bigfoot stories, seen all the blurry photos and shaky videos. I used to laugh at that stuff. Now, I'm not laughing anymore. I don't know what was in our yard that night, but I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know that somewhere in the Sierra Nevada, there's something in those woods that defies explanation. The worst part isn't the fear or the lingering questions. It's the knowing. Knowing that the world is bigger and stranger than we want to believe. Knowing that just beyond the edge of our comfortable, rational world, there are things watching us from the darkness, things that we're not ready to understand. I still have photos of those footprints somewhere, but I've never shared them, partly because I know what people will say, that they're fake, that I'm making this up, but mostly because looking at them brings it all back too vividly. The sound of that knocking, the smell, the way it moved. Some memories are better left in the past, but on sticky summer nights, when the air is thick and heavy, I still find myself looking out windows, scanning the tree line. And sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I can hear something moving out there in the darkness, watching and waiting. I've been putting off writing about this for almost 9 years now. Every time I try, my hands start shaking and I have to stop. But I need to get this out. Maybe someone else has seen what I saw up there in Barrow. Maybe I'm not crazy. I'm an experienced hiker and have been doing solo treks for over 15 years. I've encountered bears, wolves, and moose. I know how to handle myself in the wilderness. But what happened to me in Alaska in 2015? It was different. It changed me. I still can't talk about it without getting cold sweats. I'd heard about this remote trail near Barrow from another hiker on a forum. It wasn't on any official maps, but he shared GPS coordinates and said the views were incredible. Plus, it was summer, so I'd have nearly 24 hours of daylight to hike. Seemed perfect. The first couple of days were amazing. The landscape was raw, untouched. No cell service, no other hikers, just pure wilderness. I set up camp each night about 50 feet from the trail, following all the usual precautions for bear country. I had my bear spray, kept my food in sealed containers, and hung them from trees away from my tent. Basic stuff for anyone who knows what they're doing in the wild. But on the third day, something felt off. You know that feeling when you're alone, but suddenly feel watched? It started like that. Around midday, I noticed the birds had gone quiet. In all my years of hiking, I've learned that when the forest goes silent, something's wrong. I kept hiking, but stayed extra alert, hand close to my bear spray. That evening, I found a decent spot to camp near a small stream. The water was clean and I could refill my bottles. As I was setting up my tent, I noticed something odd about the stream bank. There were these massive indentations in the mud, like footprints but huge, way bigger than any bear tracks I'd ever seen. They were fresh too. The water was still seeping into them. I'm not usually the type to spook easily, but measuring those prints with my hiking boot gave me chills. Each one was at least 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. The stride length between them was enormous, easily 6 feet apart. Whatever made them was bipedal. They were clearly left foot, right foot, in a walking pattern. I considered packing up and moving, but it was already getting late. The sun was low on the horizon. It doesn't really set in Barrow during summer, just kind of circles the sky in a perpetual twilight. I decided to reinforce my camp instead. Double-checked all my gear, made sure everything that could attract wildlife was properly stored and far from my tent. I tried to sleep, but kept jerking awake at every little sound. Around what my watch said was 2 a.m., though it was still light enough to read, I heard it. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the brush maybe 100 feet from my tent. The sound was unlike anything I'd heard before. Not a bear's four-legged gait, not a moose's casual browsing. This was the sound of something massive walking on 2 legs. Then the smell hit me. People talk about the wet dog smell associated with these encounters, but this was worse. It was like rotting meat mixed with wet fur and something else, something musky and ancient that made my lizard brain scream, "Danger!" My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. The footsteps got closer. I lay there in my sleeping bag, completely still, barely breathing. Something large moved past my tent, so close I could hear deep, rasping breaths. The fabric of my tent moved slightly from the displacement of air as it passed. I could see a massive shadow through the tent wall in the dim Arctic twilight. Then it stopped. Right. Outside. My tent. I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The breathing was loud now, deep and rhythmic. The smell was overwhelming. I thought about my bear spray, but it was in the tent pocket by the door. I'd have to move to reach it, and I was terrified of making any sound. It stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, in a moment of either courage or complete stupidity, I decided to look. With trembling hands, I slowly reached for the tent zipper. The sound seemed deafening in the silence. I pulled it down just an inch, then another. Through the small gap, I saw a massive dark figure. It must have been at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark matted fur. It was standing partially turned away from my tent, head raised as if scanning the tree line. Even in profile, I could see its shoulders were impossibly broad, probably twice the width of a large man. When it turned, when it turned, I saw its face in the weird half-light. Not clearly, thank God, but enough. Enough to see that it was something that shouldn't exist. Something ancient. Something that looked almost human but was definitely, terrifyingly not. Our eyes met through that small tent opening. Its eyes reflected the twilight like a predator's. In that moment, I felt something I'd never felt before, a primal terror that bypassed all rational thought. This wasn't just fear for my life. This was the fear our ancestors must have felt when they huddled around fires in the dark, knowing there were things in the shadows that saw them as prey. It moved so fast for something so big. One moment it was there, the next it was crashing through the underbrush toward the tree line. The ground shook with each step. I heard trees cracking as it pushed through them. I didn't sleep. How could I? I sat there with my bear spray in one hand and my knife in the other, watching the shadows move around my camp. It never came back into view, but I could hear it. All night it circled, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always there. The sound of breaking branches, heavy footsteps, and occasionally a deep, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl. When the sun finally climbed a bit higher in the sky, the sound stopped. I waited another hour before I even dared to move. My hands were cramped from gripping my knife, and my whole body ached from being tensed for so long. I broke camp in record time, leaving behind anything I couldn't pack in 5 minutes. The ground around my tent was disturbed, with those same massive footprints pressed deep into the soil. There were broken branches on the surrounding trees at least 8 feet high, with tufts of dark fur caught in the bark. I practically ran back the way I came. What should have been a 2-day hike out I did in one continuous push. I didn't stop except to drink water. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the brush made me jump. I felt watched the entire time, though I never saw it again. When I finally made it back to civilization, I didn't tell anyone the full story. Who would believe me? I made up something about feeling sick and cutting the trip short. But I know what I saw. Those eyes in the darkness, that impossible size, that smell. It's all burned into my memory. I still hike, but never alone anymore, and never in really remote areas. I've researched similar encounters in Alaska over the years. There are others who've seen something up there, though most people won't talk about it openly. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I look at the photos from the previous days of that hike, the beautiful landscape, the pristine wilderness. But I deleted all the photos from that last day. I couldn't bear to look at them, at those footprints, at the broken trees. Some things are better left undocumented. I don't know what I encountered up there near Barrow. I don't want to know. But I do know this. There are things in this world that we don't understand, things that don't want to be understood. And sometimes, if you venture too far into their territory, they let you know it. Every now and then, I catch that smell again. That distinct, horrible smell, even in the city. It's probably just my imagination, my brain playing tricks on me. But when it happens, I go inside, lock the doors, and wait for daylight. Because ever since that night, I know that darkness isn't empty, and sometimes it looks back at you. What happened to me back in '89 changed my life forever, and not a day goes by that I don't think about it. I'm a farmer in rural West Virginia, about 40 miles outside of Charleston, and I've lived on this land my whole life. My family's owned this property since the 1940s, and I took it over from my father in '82. I know every inch of these 80 acres like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did until that summer. It started with my vegetable garden. I've always been proud of it. Growing my own food is something that's been passed down through generations in my family. That June, I started noticing something wasn't right. At first, it was just a few tomato plants that looked trampled, and I blamed it on deer. But then more plants started getting destroyed. Not eaten like deer or rabbits would do, but violently yanked out of the ground, roots and all. I found whole potato plants scattered around, the tubers missing. My corn stalks were snapped in half, not chewed through like when raccoons get to them. I lost about $2,000 worth of crops that first month. Being a farmer isn't exactly lucrative these days, and that was a big hit for me. I started setting up deterrents, motion sensor lights, wind chimes, even sprinklers that would go off if something large passed by. Nothing worked. Whatever was doing this was smart enough to avoid or disable everything I put up. By July, I was getting desperate. I scraped together some money and bought one of those early video cameras with night vision capabilities. It wasn't great quality, but it was all I could afford. I mounted it on a post overlooking the garden, disguised it with some branches, and ran a power cable underground back to my house. I remember feeling pretty clever about it, thinking I'd finally catch whatever was destroying my livelihood. The next morning, I went to check the camera. My heart nearly stopped when I found it. The heavy-duty metal housing was crushed like it was made of aluminum foil. The lens was shattered, and the internal components were completely destroyed. But what really got to me were the prints around the post. They looked almost human, but much larger, about 16 inches long, and the stride length was massive, easily over 6 feet. The depth of the impressions suggested whatever made them was incredibly heavy. I'm not ashamed to admit I was scared. I've dealt with bears, coyotes, and all sorts of wildlife, but this was different. The deliberate destruction of the camera, the way the prints seemed to circle the post before approaching it, it showed intelligence. I started carrying my rifle whenever I went out to do my chores. The breaking point came on August 12th. I remember the date because it was my wedding anniversary. Would have been my 15th if Sarah hadn't passed 5 years earlier. It was a moonless night, unusually quiet. Even the crickets seemed silent. I was sitting in my living room, trying to distract myself with some paperwork, when I felt it. At first I thought it was a small earthquake. We get them occasionally in this part of West Virginia. But this was different. It was more like a rhythmic tremor, almost like footsteps, but much heavier than anything I'd ever felt before. Then I heard the sound from near my barn, a deep rumbling growl that made the hair on my neck stand up. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard, and I've heard just about everything these woods can throw at you. This sound. It was almost human, but distorted, like someone trying to speak underwater. I grabbed my rifle and flashlight. I know it was stupid, but I had to know what was out there. The tremors were getting stronger as I approached the barn. The air felt different, heavy and thick with a musty organic smell I can't really describe. It was like wet fur mixed with something earthy and ancient. When I rounded the corner of the barn, I saw it. Even now, years later, I have trouble describing what I saw. It was tall, at least 8 feet, maybe more. It was standing upright next to my storage shed, holding one of my apple tree saplings it had apparently pulled up by the roots. The beam from my flashlight caught its fur, dark brown or black, I couldn't tell in the darkness, but it had a strange sheen to it, almost oily. But it was its face that haunts me to this day. It wasn't quite human, wasn't quite ape. Something in between that shouldn't exist. Its eyes reflected my flashlight beam with a reddish glow, and when it turned to look at me, I saw intelligence there. Not animal intelligence, but something that could think, something that knew exactly what it was doing. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. My rifle was frozen in my hands. I couldn't have fired if I wanted to. Then it made that sound again, that underwater growl, and I swear to God it smiled. Not a friendly smile, the kind of smile a wolf might give if it could smile, all teeth and threat. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I could feel the tremors following me, getting closer. I made it to my house and slammed the door, throwing every lock I had. The tremors circled my house for hours. Sometimes they'd stop and I'd think it was gone, but then they'd start again from a different direction. Around dawn, they finally stopped. When I worked up the courage to look outside, everything was quiet. The only evidence anything had happened was some broken branches, those massive footprints, and the uprooted sapling lying next to the shed. That was 35 years ago. I still live on the same farm. It's my home, and I won't be driven away. But things have changed. I don't grow vegetables anymore, just hay and corn for livestock. I installed better security lights and cameras, but they never catch anything unusual. But I know it's still out there. Sometimes on quiet nights, I feel those tremors again. They're fainter now, more distant, but they're there. The worst part isn't the tremors or the memories of what I saw, it's the feeling of being watched. Every time I step outside, especially at night, I can feel eyes on me. Sometimes I'll catch movement at the edge of my fields, something too big to be a bear, too upright to be natural, but it never shows itself like it did that night. I've heard stories since then, from other farmers in the area. Missing livestock, destroyed equipment, those same heavy footsteps. But no one's ever gotten as close as I did, and honestly, I hope they never do. Whatever that thing was, the tremor man, as some locals have started calling it, it wasn't just some undiscovered animal. It knew what it was doing. It wanted me to see it that night. Why? I don't know. Maybe as a warning, maybe as some kind of twisted greeting. I still carry my rifle when I go out at night. I keep my security lights on from dusk till dawn. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed and I feel those faint tremors in the distance, I wonder if any of that would really help if it decided to come back. Because deep down, I know one thing for certain. That night in '89, it wasn't hunting me. It was studying me. And sometimes late at night I wonder if it still is. Some people have suggested I sell the farm and move away. Others think I should try to get proof, set up better cameras, organize searches. But I won't. What I saw that night wasn't meant to be proven or captured. It was meant to remind me, remind all of us, that we don't know everything about this world. that there are things in these old mountains that are better left alone. I don't expect everyone to believe my story. Hell, sometimes I wake up wondering if I dreamed the whole thing. But then I'll step outside on a quiet morning and feel those eyes on me, hear a distant tremor in the ground, and I know it was real. It's still out there, somewhere in these hills, watching and waiting. For what? I don't know, but I hope I never have to find out. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but after 14 years, I still can't shake what happened that night on that secluded beach near Vancouver. My hands are actually trembling as I type this. It's crazy how vivid these memories still are. It was summer 2010, and my friends and I had been planning this camping trip for months. There were 4 of us, me, my college buddies Mike and Sarah's boyfriend Tom. We were all in our mid-20s and had done plenty of camping before, but this spot was different. It was this gorgeous hidden beach you could only reach by boat, about 2 hours from Vancouver. Mike's uncle had a small fishing boat he'd let us borrow, and we thought we'd found the perfect escape from the city. The first day was exactly what we'd hoped for. Crystal clear water, no other people in sight, just pure wilderness. We set up our 2 tents about 50 feet from the shoreline, right where the beach met this dense forest. The weather was perfect, mid-70s, slight breeze, hardly any clouds. We spent the day swimming, fishing, caught nothing though, and just enjoying being completely disconnected from everything. No cell service, no other humans for miles. Looking back, maybe that should have worried us more than it did. That second night started normally enough. We'd made dinner on our camping stove, just some basic pasta with canned sauce, and were sitting around the fire sharing beers and telling stories. It must have been around 10:30 p.m. when everything changed. The fire was getting low, and we were all getting pretty tired when we heard it. At first, it was this weird tapping sound coming from the forest behind us, like someone hitting a tree with a stick, but in this steady rhythm, thump, thump, thump. We all kind of looked at each other, thinking maybe it was just a woodpecker or something, even though we knew woodpeckers aren't active at night. That's when we heard the growl. I've been in the woods my whole life. I've heard bears, cougars, all kinds of wildlife. This wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It was this deep guttural sound that seemed to come from something massive. Not aggressive exactly, but powerful. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up instantly. Sarah grabbed Tom's arm so hard he winced. Mike was frozen mid-sip with his beer. I remember my mouth going completely dry as I slowly turned toward the tree line. That's when I saw it, and I swear my heart nearly stopped. Between 2 massive pine trees, maybe 40 yards from our camp, there was this figure. The fire wasn't giving off much light by then, but what we could see was enough to make my blood run cold. It was huge. I'm talking at least 8 feet tall, and covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. The way it was standing was so human-like, but not quite right. Its arms were too long, hanging down past its knees, and its shoulders were impossibly broad. The worst part was that it was just watching us, not moving, not making any noise anymore, just standing there in the shadows. I could feel its eyes on us, even though I couldn't make out its face clearly. The whole thing probably only lasted a few minutes, but it felt like hours. None of us dared move or speak. We barely breathed. Then it shifted its weight, and I heard branches cracking under its feet. It had to be incredibly heavy to make that much noise just by moving slightly. That's when Sarah let out this tiny whimper, and the thing, it tilted its head like it was studying us. Then it just turned and walked away into the darkness. The movement was so smooth, so deliberate, not like a bear or any other 4-legged animal. This thing was walking on 2 legs, disappearing into the forest like a person would, just bigger, much bigger. We sat there in complete silence for what felt like forever, straining to hear any sound of it coming back. The forest had gone completely quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just dead silence. Finally, Mike whispered, "What the fuck was that?" Nobody answered because honestly, what could we say? There was no way any of us were sleeping in those tents. We dragged our sleeping bags out and huddled together by the fire, which we built up as big as we dared. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had us jumping. I've never been so aware of how vulnerable humans are in the wilderness as I was that night. The worst part was around 3 a.m. when we heard that tapping sound again, but this time from a different direction further down the beach. It was the same rhythm, thump, thump, thump. Then we heard what sounded like wood splintering, like something incredibly strong was breaking apart a fallen tree with its bare hands. The sound echoed across the water, and I remember thinking how trapped we were on that beach. We couldn't leave. The boat was anchored offshore, and none of us was about to try swimming out to it in the dark. When the sun finally came up, we were all still awake, huddled together like scared kids. As soon as it was light enough, we packed up our camp in record time. Nobody wanted to say it, but we were all terrified that thing might come back in broad daylight. While we were packing, Mike found something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints in the sand, leading from the forest to about 20 feet from where we'd been sitting. They were huge, easily twice the size of my boot, and deep. Whatever made them was incredibly heavy. The stride length between them was massive too, like 4 or 5 feet apart. The boat ride back was completely silent. What could we even say? We'd all seen it, we'd all heard it, but it felt like talking about it would make it too real. Even now, 14 years later, we rarely discuss that night, though I know none of us has forgotten it. Sarah and Tom moved to Toronto the following year, saying they needed to live in a big city. Mike still lives in Vancouver, but refuses to go camping anymore. I've spent countless hours researching what we might have seen. I've read about Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest, looked at blurry photos and shaky videos, but nothing quite matches what we encountered. The size, the way it moved, that horrible growl, it was all different from any known animal. Sometimes I try to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a bear standing up. Maybe our minds were playing tricks on us in the dark. But then I remember those footprints in the morning light, and that deliberate, almost human way it walked away into the forest, and I know what we saw was real. Whatever it was intelligent enough to observe us, to study us, and thankfully, to leave us alone. I haven't been back to that beach since, and I never will. Some places should just be left alone, and whatever lives in those woods clearly wants to be left alone too. But sometimes, on quiet nights when I can't sleep, I still hear that rhythmic thumping in my head, and I wonder if it's still out there, watching other unsuspecting campers from the shadows of those ancient forests. I've worked as a forest ranger in Vermont for over 20 years now, but what happened to me back in 2001 still haunts me. I'm finally sharing this because I need to get it off my chest, even though I was told to keep quiet about it. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar. It was early December, and I was doing my usual patrol in one of the more remote areas of the state forest. The temperature had dropped below freezing the night before, leaving about 4 inches of fresh snow on the ground. Perfect tracking conditions, I thought at the time. How naive I was. I was checking on a trail that had been closed to the public due to some erosion issues when I noticed something odd in the snow. At first I thought it might be bear tracks. We get plenty of those. But something felt off. The prints were huge, easily 16 inches long, and had a distinctly human-like shape to them. But no human could have feet that big. What really got me was the stride length. These prints were spaced about 6 feet apart. I've tracked all kinds of wildlife in my career. I know what bear tracks look like, what moose tracks look like. Hell, I can even identify fisher-cat prints. But these were something else entirely. My first instinct was to radio it in, but something stopped me. I needed to investigate further to make sure I wasn't just seeing things. As I followed the tracks, the air around me changed. It's hard to describe, but anyone who spends time in the woods knows that feeling when something's not right. The forest got quieter. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but that eerie silence that makes your skin crawl. Then the smell hit me. If you've ever come across a dead animal that's been lying around for a few days, imagine that, but mixed with this musty, moldy smell, like wet fur and decay. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I followed the tracks for about half a mile before they veered off into a particularly dense section of forest. By then, the sun was starting to set, and protocol dictated that I head back to my cabin. Part of me was relieved. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. Something felt very wrong about this whole situation. That night, I was in my cabin doing paperwork, trying to figure out how to report what I'd found without sounding crazy. The cabin's not much, just a simple one-room structure with a small kitchen area, a desk and a bed. But it's sturdy, and it's always felt safe. Until that night. Around 10:30 p.m. I heard what sounded like footsteps in the snow outside. Heavy footsteps. Working alone in remote areas, you get used to strange noises at night, but this was different. These footsteps were deliberate, slow, and way too heavy to be from any normal wildlife. Then came the smell again, that same rotting, musty odor from earlier, seeping in through the cabin's walls. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. I kept perfectly still in my chair, barely breathing. The footsteps circled the cabin once, twice, and then stopped right outside my window. I'll never forget what I saw next. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Through the window I could make out a massive dark shape, easily 8 feet tall. It was broader than any bear I'd ever seen, and covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. The way it moved was wrong. Too fluid for something that size, almost graceful, but in a terrifying way. Then it turned its head toward the window, and I swear it knew I was watching. I couldn't make out its face clearly in the darkness, thank God, but I could see the steam from its breath in the cold air. It was so close, probably only 3 feet from where I sat, frozen in terror. Suddenly, it made this sound, not quite a growl, not quite a huff, but something in between, deep and resonant, like it came from something with massive lungs. Then it did something that chills me to this day. It reached out and placed one enormous hand against the cabin wall. I could hear the wood creaking under its weight. I don't know what made me do it, but I grabbed my flashlight and shone it directly at the window. The beam caught its body for just a second before it moved with surprising speed, disappearing into the darkness. But that brief glimpse was enough. The fur wasn't black like I'd thought. It was a deep reddish-brown and had an almost oily sheen to it. I spent the rest of the night with my back against the wall, my rifle in my lap, listening to every sound outside. But it didn't come back. When dawn finally came, I went outside to look for evidence. The tracks were there, just like before, circling the cabin exactly as I'd heard. I also found tufts of that reddish-brown fur caught on the rough wood of the cabin wall, but when I went to collect them, they crumbled to dust in my hands. I reported everything to my supervisor that morning. She listened carefully, took detailed notes, and then told me in no uncertain terms that this information wasn't to leave the department. They sent out a team to investigate, but officially they found nothing conclusive. The tracks were dismissed as belonging to a large bear, despite their clearly bipedal nature. I still work the same area, but I never patrol alone anymore. I requested a partner after that night, claiming it was for safety reasons related to the terrain. My supervisor approved it without question. I think she understood the real reason. Sometimes, on cold winter nights when I'm out on patrol, I catch that smell again, that distinct mixture of decay and musk. When that happens, I turn around and head back immediately. I've learned that some things in these woods don't want to be found, and maybe it's better that way. I know what I saw that night wasn't a bear, or any other known animal. Whatever it was intelligent enough to know it was being watched, strong enough to make solid wood creak under its touch, and smart enough to stay hidden from the world. I've heard rumors of similar encounters from other rangers over the years, but nobody talks about it openly. The forests of Vermont hold secrets, and after that night, I'm content to let them stay secret. I still do my job, but I've developed a deep respect for the unknown things that might be sharing these woods with us. If you're ever hiking in Vermont's forests, and catch a whiff of something that smells like death and wet fur, or hear heavy footsteps in the darkness, don't investigate, just turn around and leave. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. I've been holding this story inside for over 25 years now, and I think it's finally time to share what happened to me and my son Jake back in '97. I still get chills thinking about those 3 days in the Poconos Mountains, and honestly, I've avoided telling this story because I was afraid people would think I'm crazy, but I need to get this off my chest. Back then, Jake was 14, and I was trying to be a better dad after my divorce. We'd started doing these father-son fishing trips, just the two of us, away from all the drama at home. I'd found this little cabin near a creek in the Poconos, Nothing fancy, just a basic shelter with 2 beds, a wood stove, and enough space to keep our gear dry. It was pretty remote, maybe 3 miles from the nearest paved road, but that's exactly what I wanted. No distractions, no video games, just me and my boy reconnecting. We arrived on a Friday afternoon in early October. The fall colors were just starting to show, and there was this crisp feel in the air that made it perfect fishing weather. The drive up had been quiet. Jake was in that teenage phase where everything I said was either embarrassing or annoying, but I could tell he was excited about the fishing part at least. The first day went great. We caught a few decent-sized trout, cooked them over the fire, and actually had some good conversations. Jake even laughed at one of my stupid dad jokes, which felt like a major victory. As night fell, we played cards by lantern light and turned in early, planning to get up at dawn for the morning bite. That's when things started getting weird. I woke up around 2 a.m. to what sounded like something heavy walking around outside the cabin. At first, I thought it might be a bear. We'd had them around before, and I always kept our food stored properly to avoid attracting them. But this was different. The footsteps were slower, more deliberate, and they seemed to pause between each step like whatever it was being careful. Then I heard the breathing. It wasn't like any animal breathing I'd ever heard before. It was deep, almost like someone with pneumonia trying to catch their breath, but much louder. Each exhale seemed to rattle something in my chest. I lay there in my sleeping bag, completely frozen, listening to this thing circle our cabin. Jake was still asleep, and I didn't dare wake him up, partly because I didn't want to frighten him, but mostly because I was terrified that any noise might provoke whatever was out there. The footsteps and breathing continued for what felt like hours, though my watch later told me it was only about 45 minutes. Eventually, they faded away into the forest, but I didn't sleep another wink that night. I kept the rifle close, though something in my gut told me it wouldn't do much good if that thing decided to come back. When morning came, I almost convinced myself it had been a dream. Jake was excited to get fishing, and I didn't want to spoil the mood by mentioning what had happened. But as we walked down to the creek, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a muddy patch near the water's edge where we'd been fishing the day before. In that mud were footprints, if you could even call them that. They were huge, easily 16 inches long and incredibly wide. The impression was deep, too, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. I've been hunting all my life, and I've seen every kind of track these woods can produce. These weren't bear tracks, weren't moose tracks, weren't anything I could explain. I tried to act normal for Jake's sake, but I kept scanning the tree line. The forest felt different now, like we were being watched. Every snap of a twig made me jump. Jake noticed something was off and kept asking if I was okay. I made up some excuse about bad sleep and caffeine jitters. That night, I made sure our fire was extra big and kept it going well past our usual bedtime. Jake thought it was great. We roasted marshmallows and talked about school, his friends, normal stuff, but I was on edge the whole time, straining to hear anything unusual over the crackling of the flames. The second night was quiet, almost too quiet. No owls, no rustling in the undergrowth, nothing. It was like every animal in the woods was holding its breath. We both managed to get some sleep, but I kept waking up to check the windows and doors were secure. The third day is when everything went to hell. We were fishing different spots along the creek, maybe 50 yards apart, but still within sight of each other. It was around 4 p.m., and the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, creating long shadows across the water. I was focused on retying a lure when I heard Jake make this strange, choked sound. When I looked up, he was standing completely still, his rod forgotten at his feet, staring across the creek. Following his gaze, I saw it. A massive dark figure moving through the trees on the opposite bank. It was partially hidden behind the foliage, but what I could see made no sense. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair or fur, and it moved with this eerily smooth gait that was both graceful and terrifying. The thing that really got me, though, was how quietly it moved. Something that big should have been crashing through the brush, but it barely made a sound. It seemed to flow between the trees like smoke, always keeping just enough cover to prevent a clear view. Jake started to back up slowly toward me, and I motioned for him to keep moving. The figure stopped when Jake moved, and I swear I could feel it watching us. There was this overwhelming sensation of intelligence behind that gaze. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. We backed away until we reached the path to the cabin, then turned and walked as fast as we could without running. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I never saw it follow us. Somehow, that made it worse. When we got back to the cabin, Jake was shaking so bad he could barely help me pack our gear. I've never packed up camp so fast in my life. We left some stuff behind, a tackle box, some cooking gear, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get my son out of there. The whole time we were packing, there was this tension in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. I kept expecting to hear those heavy footsteps coming through the trees, or see that dark figure emerge from the forest. The hike back to the car was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Every shadow looked like a massive figure. Every breeze sounded like labored breathing. Jake didn't say a word the whole time, just clutched his backpack straps and kept pace with me. It wasn't until we were in the car with the doors locked and the engine running that Jake finally spoke. "Dad," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "What was that thing?" I didn't have an answer for him then, and I still don't have one now. We've never really talked about it since that day. Sometimes I think about going back, about trying to find some explanation for what we saw, but I can't bring myself to do it. That place took something from us, not just our sense of safety in the woods, but also this idea that we understand our world and what lives in it. I've read about other encounters since then, about things people have seen in remote areas that don't fit into our neat categories of what should exist. Some of them sound a lot like what we experienced. I don't know if it was what people call Bigfoot or something else entirely, but I know what we saw was real. Jake's 41 now, with kids of his own, but he still won't go camping. Says he prefers hotels. Can't say I blame him. I still fish, still hunt, but never in the Poconos, and never anywhere I can't see my car from where I'm standing. Some experiences change you forever, and what happened during those 3 days in 1997 definitely changed us. I keep thinking about that figure by the creek, how it moved with such purpose, such awareness. Sometimes I wonder if it was as scared of us as we were of it, or if it was just curious, or maybe something else entirely. But mostly I wonder how many other people have stories like mine that they're too afraid to tell. That's really all there is to tell. I've never shared this story publicly before, and I probably won't again. I'm not looking for explanations or theories. I've had 25 years to come up with those on my own. I just needed to finally let this out, to put it into words. Maybe somewhere out there, someone else has seen what we saw, felt what we felt. If you have, you're not crazy, and you're not alone. I've been holding this in for almost 18 years now, and I think it's finally time I share what happened to me and my climbing buddies back in 2006. I still get goosebumps thinking about those nights in Yosemite, and honestly, writing this is making my hands shake a bit. I've only told this story to my closest family, and even then, I've left out some details because I know how crazy it sounds. I was 28 at the time and had been climbing for over a decade. My friends Tom, Mike, and Sarah were all experienced climbers too. We'd tackled some pretty challenging routes together over the years. This wasn't our first time in Yosemite either. We'd been there at least half a dozen times before, usually sticking to the more popular climbing spots. But this time, we wanted something different, something more remote. We'd heard about this amazing climbing spot deep in the park's backcountry. It was early October, perfect climbing weather, and we figured the more isolated location would mean we'd have the walls all to ourselves. The hike in took about 6 hours, longer than we expected. We had to navigate through some pretty dense forest, and the trail wasn't well marked. Looking back, maybe that should have been our first warning sign. We set up camp in this small clearing, maybe about 200 feet from the base of the wall we planned to climb. The spot was gorgeous. Tall pines all around, a small stream nearby, and this massive rock face looming above us. We got there around 4 p.m., set up our 3 tents in a triangle formation, and had a simple dinner of freeze-dried meals and trail mix. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. The first weird thing I noticed was how quiet it got after sunset. I mean, wilderness always gets quiet at night. But this was different. It was like someone had hit the mute button on the forest. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just this heavy silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I remember looking at Sarah across our small campfire and seeing she'd noticed it too. We turned in around 10 p.m., planning to get an early start the next day. I was sharing a tent with Tom, while Mike and Sarah had their own tents. I don't know exactly what time it happened. My watch was in my backpack, and I was too terrified to check it later. But I was jolted awake by this sound. Look, I've heard all sorts of animal calls in the wilderness, bears, mountain lions, elk, you name it, but this wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It started as this low, rumbling sound, almost like distant thunder, but then it changed into this scream that, God, even now I struggle to describe it. It was like a mix between a human scream and something else, something bigger. The pitch was all wrong for any animal I know, and the volume. Jesus, the volume. It felt like it was coming from everywhere at once, like the whole forest was screaming. Tom was already sitting up in his sleeping bag, and I could see his silhouette in the darkness. Neither of us said a word. We were both frozen. The scream lasted maybe 15 seconds, but it felt like forever. Then it stopped, and that silence from earlier came crashing back, somehow even heavier than before. "What the fuck was that?" Tom whispered, his voice shaking. Before I could answer, we heard Mike calling from his tent, asking if we'd heard it too. Of course we had. How could anyone not have heard that? We all scrambled out of our tents, headlamps on, forming a tight circle. Sarah was clutching her bear spray, but we all knew this wasn't a bear. Bears don't scream like that. Nothing screams like that. Our lights caught something that made my stomach drop. About 30 feet from our camp, a pine tree, and I mean a big one, at least 2 feet in diameter, was snapped about halfway up. Not fallen over, not struck by lightning, but snapped, with the top half dangling at an impossible angle. I swear that tree had been intact when we set up camp. Mike, always the rational one, suggested we check the perimeter of our camp. We stayed together, all 4 of us, moving our lights slowly across the ground and through the trees. That's when we found the prints. I've done plenty of tracking in my life. I know what bear prints look like, what mountain lion prints look like. These were different. They were huge, maybe 15 inches long and humanoid but not human. The stride length between them was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet. They made a rough circle around our camp, like whatever made them had been pacing, watching us. We followed them for about 50 feet before they just disappeared. Not faded out, not crossed with other tracks, just stopped, like whatever made them had vanished into thin air. By this point, we were all pretty freaked out, but no one wanted to say what we were all thinking. We ended up huddling around our rebuilt campfire, all of us too wired to even think about sleeping. We talked about packing up right then, but the thought of trying to hike out in the dark seemed even worse than staying put. So we waited. Around 3 a.m., yes, I finally worked up the courage to check my watch. It happened again. The same thunderous build-up, the same impossible scream. But this time, it was closer, much closer, and this time we saw something. Our fire had died down to embers, and in the dim light, we saw a shadow move between the trees. When I say shadow, I mean something that seemed to absorb what little light there was. It was huge. I'm talking at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. It moved in this fluid way that something that big shouldn't be able to move. Sarah grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises I'd find the next day. We all saw it circle our camp, just on the edge of the firelight. None of us moved. None of us breathed. I remember thinking, this is it. This is how I die. The shadow stopped moving at one point, and I swear it was looking right at us. You know that feeling when you're being watched? Multiply that by 1,000. I felt like a mouse being stared down by a hawk. Then it made this sound, not the scream from before, but this deep rumbling growl that you didn't so much hear as feel in your bones. Just when I thought my heart was going to explode from fear, it moved away. We heard branches snapping as it retreated, each crash getting more distant until they faded entirely. We didn't waste any time after that. We broke camp in record time, leaving behind anything that wasn't absolutely essential. The hike out was a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. Every snapping twig made us jump. Every shadow looked like a giant. We made it back to the parking lot just as the sun was rising. Here's the thing that still haunts me. When we got back to civilization, and eventually worked up the courage to tell a park ranger about what happened, he just got this look on his face. He didn't seem surprised. He didn't write anything down. He just asked us exactly where we'd been camping and made a note of it in this worn-looking notebook he pulled from his desk. "You're not the first," was all he said before walking away. "I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened that night. I've read every scientific paper I could find about animal behavior in Yosemite. I've talked to wildlife experts. Nobody has been able to explain what we experienced. The closest I've come to an answer was from an old guide I met a few years later who'd worked in the park for decades. When I told him my story, he just nodded and said, 'Some places in those woods, they don't belong to us. Never did.' Tom, Mike, Sarah and I still climb together sometimes, but never in Yosemite. We've all silently agreed to stick to more populated areas now, and we never camp in the backcountry anymore. Never. I know how this story sounds. Trust me, if someone had told me this before it happened, I wouldn't have believed them either. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard, and I know that somewhere deep in Yosemite there's something that defies explanation, something that occasionally reminds humans that we're not at the top of the food chain after all. I still dream about that shadow sometimes, about that sound that was almost human but definitely wasn't. And every time I do, I wake up with that same feeling I had that night. That primal, gut-deep certainty that I was being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. Sometimes I think about going back, about trying to find answers. But then I remember that look on the ranger's face, and that feeling of being watched by something ancient and powerful, and I know I never will. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. It happened in late September 2018. I was 23 at the time, and my friends Jake, Sarah and Mike, all around the same age, had planned this camping trip for weeks. We weren't exactly experienced hikers, but we weren't complete newbies either. We'd done a few overnight trips before, mostly in more populated camping areas. This time, though, we wanted to try something more remote. You know, really get that authentic wilderness experience. Looking back, I wish we'd stuck to the tourist spots. We picked a spot in the Olympic National Forest, about a 4-hour hike from the nearest ranger station. The weather was perfect that morning. Crisp autumn air, clear skies, that kind of weather that makes you feel invincible. We started our hike around 9 a.m., carrying our usual gear, tents, sleeping bags, enough food for 3 days, basic survival stuff. Everything felt normal, peaceful even for the first few hours. The first weird thing I noticed was around 2 p.m. I kept getting this feeling that something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. You know that sensation when you feel like someone's watching you? It was like that, but stronger. The forest had gotten quieter too, which I didn't register as strange at first, but looking back, it should have been our first warning sign. No bird calls, no squirrels rustling in the trees, just the sound of our boots crunching leaves and our own voices. Sarah mentioned feeling uneasy too, but Mike and Jake brushed it off as typical forest jitters. We kept hiking until we found our planned camping spot around 4 p.m., a small clearing near a stream surrounded by thick forest. It was beautiful, really, with these massive Douglas firs towering over us. We set up our 2 tents, got a fire going, and started cooking dinner. Everything seemed fine, but that feeling of being watched never went away. The sun started setting around 6:30 p.m., and that's when things started getting really weird. We were sitting around the fire having just finished our freeze-dried meals when we heard it, a loud crack of breaking branches maybe 100 feet behind my tent, not like a small animal moving through the underbrush, but like something big and heavy stepping on dead wood. Jake grabbed his flashlight and pointed it in that direction, but we couldn't see anything. The trees were too dense, and the darkness between them seemed somehow thicker than it should have been. We tried to laugh it off, probably just a deer or elk, right? But deep down, I knew this was different. The sound had been too deliberate, too measured. Over the next hour, we kept hearing movement in the forest around us. It was like whatever it was circling our camp, always staying just out of sight. The sounds would stop for 15, 20 minutes, then start up again from a different direction. We huddled closer to the fire, trying to convince ourselves it was nothing to worry about. Then the rocks started. The first one landed about 10 feet from our fire pit, a stone about the size of my fist. We all jumped, and Mike yelled, "What the hell?" We thought maybe it had fallen from somewhere, but there weren't any cliffs or steep slopes nearby. Before we could process what was happening, another rock landed on the other side of our camp. Sarah was practically in tears at this point, and honestly, I wasn't far behind. These rocks weren't just falling. They were being thrown, and whatever was throwing them was smart enough to stay hidden in the darkness. That's when I saw it. Just for a second, in the gap between two trees about 40 feet from our camp. The fire cast just enough light, and I caught a glimpse of something that still haunts my nightmares. It was tall, way taller than any person I've ever seen, probably 8 or 9 feet at least, and it was covered in what looked like dark matted fur. But what really got me was how it moved, so fluid and deliberate, like it knew exactly what it was doing. It was there for maybe 2 seconds before it stepped back into the darkness, but those 2 seconds changed everything I thought I knew about what exists in our forests. Nobody wanted to say the word Bigfoot out loud, but we were all thinking it. The thing is, this didn't feel like the gentle giant from the beef jerky commercials or those funny viral videos. This felt predatory, intelligent, and it was definitely toying with us. Around 9 p.m., things escalated. The creature started making these sounds, not quite growls, not quite grunts, but something in between. They seemed to come from multiple directions, which either meant there was more than one, or it was moving around us incredibly fast. The sounds had this weird quality to them, almost like they were meant to disorient us. It worked. We decided we couldn't stay there. The thought of spending the entire night with that thing, or things, circling us was unbearable. We quickly packed our essential gear, leaving the tents behind. None of us wanted to waste time taking them down. With our backpacks and flashlights, we started making our way back down the trail we'd come up on. That's when the true terror began. As we walked, trying to move as quickly and quietly as possible, we could hear it paralleling us in the forest. Heavy footsteps keeping pace with us, sometimes on one side of the trail, sometimes on the other. Occasionally, we'd hear it moving through the underbrush ahead of us, like it was trying to cut us off. The moon was barely visible through the canopy, and our flashlight beams seemed pathetically inadequate. We walked practically shoulder to shoulder, stumbling in our panic. Every few minutes, another rock would land near us on the trail. Not close enough to hit us, but close enough to let us know we were being hunted. The worst part was when we heard what sounded like laughing. Not human laughter, but not animal either. It was this deep, rhythmic sound that made my skin crawl. Sarah started crying again, and I remember Mike saying, "This isn't happening, this isn't real," over and over under his breath. We walked for what felt like hours, though it was probably closer to 2. The whole time that thing stayed with us, always just out of sight. Sometimes the sounds would stop for a few minutes, and those silences were almost worse than the noises. At least when we could hear it, we knew where it was. Finally, around 11:30 p.m., we saw the lights from the ranger station in the distance. As soon as they came into view, everything stopped. The footsteps, the rock throwing, all of it. It was like whatever had been stalking us didn't want to get too close to civilization. We burst into the ranger station, probably looking like complete lunatics, covered in sweat, eyes wild with fear, Sarah still crying. The ranger on duty tried to calm us down, but we were all talking at once, trying to explain what had happened. He radioed another ranger to go check out our campsite the next day, but I already knew they wouldn't find anything significant. It's been almost 6 years, and I still have nightmares about that night. Sometimes I wake up hearing those heavy footsteps or that terrible laugh. I've done research since then, read about other encounters in the Olympic National Forest, and while some stories share similarities with ours, none quite capture the intelligence and malevolence we experienced. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. Sarah moved to Arizona shortly after, saying she needed to live somewhere with fewer trees. Jake and Mike still go hiking occasionally, but never in Washington, and never overnight. The thing that really gets me, though, is knowing it's still out there. Whatever it wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. It was calculating, methodical, almost playful in a cruel way. It could have hurt us if it wanted to, I'm sure of that. Instead, it chose to terrorize us, to let us know we were in its territory and at its mercy. I don't expect anyone to believe this story, but I needed to share it. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was all just a mass hallucination or something, but then I remember the sound of those footsteps following us down the trail, and I know it was real. If you're planning to go hiking in the Olympic National Forest, stick to the populated areas. Some parts of the wilderness don't want to be explored, and some things out there are better left alone. I've been holding this in for almost 20 years now, and I think it's finally time to share what happened to me in the Okefenokee swamp back in 2004. I used to be an avid fisherman, emphasis on used to be. What I experienced that day changed everything for me, and I haven't been able to step foot in those swamps since. It was mid-October, during that perfect time when the weather in Georgia starts cooling down, but isn't cold enough to keep you from enjoying the outdoors. I'd been fishing these waters for over 15 years at that point, usually going out 2 or 3 times a week. That day started like any other. I loaded up my John boat before sunrise, packed my usual gear, some sandwiches, and enough water to last the day. I had a favorite spot deep in the swamp, about an hour's boat ride from the nearest launch point. It was this quiet little area where the cypress trees created a natural alcove, and the water was usually calm enough to spot the fish moving below the surface. The spot was off the main waterways, which meant I rarely saw another soul out there. That's exactly how I liked it. I got to my spot around 7 a.m., anchored the boat, and started fishing. The morning was productive. I'd caught a few decent-sized bass and was feeling pretty good about my day. Everything was normal until about 4 p.m., when the sun was starting to get lower in the sky. The first thing I noticed was how the usual swamp sounds changed. If you spend enough time in nature, you learn to read these changes. Usually there's a constant background noise, birds, insects, frogs, you name it. But suddenly, everything got quieter. Not silent, mind you, but muted, like someone had turned down the volume on a TV. That's when I started hearing the whispers. At first I thought it was just the wind in the cypress trees, but there was barely any breeze that day. These sounds, they were different. They seemed to come from all around me, like someone or something was moving through the vegetation on the banks. There were these soft, shuffling sounds, followed by what I can only describe as whispers, but not in any language I've ever heard. It was more like breathing mixed with low, guttural sounds. I'm not easily spooked. 20 years of fishing in swamps teaches you to deal with all sorts of situations. But something about those sounds made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My hands started sweating, and I felt this overwhelming urge to get out of there. That's when I saw it. About 30 yards away, moving between the cypress trees, was this figure. I know how this sounds, but I swear on everything I hold dear that what I saw was real. It was tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, and covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. The way it moved wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. It wasn't lumbering or clumsy like you might expect from something that size. It was quick, fluid, almost graceful in how it weaved between the trees. I froze. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to start the motor and get out of there, but I knew that any sudden movement or noise might draw its attention. So I sat there, barely breathing, watching as this thing moved along the bank. The sun was getting lower, casting long shadows through the trees, and that's when things got worse. The creature suddenly stopped moving and turned in my direction. I couldn't make out its face clearly. Thank God for that. But I could feel it watching me. Then it did something that still haunts my dreams. It started making this sound, this deep, resonating sound that seemed to vibrate right through my chest. It wasn't a growl or a roar. It was deeper than that, almost like the lowest note on a pipe organ, but organic and alive. It started moving closer to the water's edge, now maybe 15 feet from my boat. I remember gripping my fishing rod so tight my knuckles were white, but I didn't dare move an inch. I could smell it now, a strong, musky odor that made my eyes water. The creature was so close I could see its fur moving in the evening breeze, could see the muscles rippling under its coat. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Me, frozen in my boat, and this thing standing at the water's edge, making that terrible sound. Then, as the last direct sunlight was fading from the swamp, it slowly turned and moved away, disappearing into the gathering darkness with that same unnaturally fluid movement. I waited until I couldn't hear it anymore before I even dared to breathe normally. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pull up the anchor. I've never started my boat motor so carefully in my life, and I've never driven it so fast once I got going. I didn't stop until I reached the boat ramp, and I didn't fully relax until I was in my truck with the doors locked. I sold my boat the following week. Sold most of my fishing gear too. Some people have called me crazy when I've tried to talk about this. They say I probably saw a bear, or my mind was playing tricks on me in the fading light. But I know what I saw. I've seen plenty of bears in my time fishing those swamps, and this wasn't anything like that. The thing that really gets to me, even after all these years, is the intelligence I sensed from it. The way it moved, the way it watched me. There was purpose there, awareness. Sometimes I wonder if it had been watching me long before I noticed it that day. Maybe on all those other fishing trips, when I was alone in my favorite spot, thinking I had the swamp to myself, something had been watching me the whole time. I still fish occasionally, but only in public lakes with plenty of other people around. I haven't been back to the Okefenokee since that day, and I never will. Some people say these swamps hold secrets, things that haven't changed since prehistoric times. After what I experienced, I believe them. There are things out there we aren't meant to understand, and sometimes it's better to just stay away. That's my story. Take it for what you will, but I know what I saw that day. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I still hear that deep, resonating sound in my head, and I wonder if somewhere in those dark waters, that thing is still there, watching and waiting for someone else to venture too far into its territory. I know it might sound weird, and to be honest, I'm not sure if I'll ever really understand what happened to me that day. But I figured I'd share it here, since I've seen people talking about strange experiences in the woods, and maybe someone else has gone through something similar. It was back in 2002, on the Ruckle Creek Trail in Oregon. I was hiking alone, which, yeah, I know, not the smartest move. But I liked the solitude back then, being away from everything, just the quiet of the woods and the trail beneath my boots. I wasn't expecting anything other than a peaceful afternoon. It was a late afternoon, the kind where the sun's just starting to dip behind the treetops, and the shadows get a bit longer, making everything feel just a little more isolated. I'd been out there for hours, just meandering, not really in a rush to get anywhere. Then suddenly I heard it, a noise from the trees. It wasn't subtle. It was a heavy crashing sound, like something big was moving through the underbrush. Instinctively I thought bear, and froze. I mean, what else could it be, right? It wasn't a small rustle. It was like a whole tree was being shoved aside. I remember standing there holding my breath, scanning the thick growth around me. The noise kept getting closer, and my heart was pounding. But then I saw it, something dark moving through the trees, heading up the hill to my right. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't moving like one either. It was running, almost in a hunched-over way, but fast, like way faster than I expected. My first thought, oddly enough, was that it looked like a gorilla, the broad back, the massive arms, the way it hunched forward. But it was taller, lankier, and definitely not supposed to be out here. I tried to pull my camera out, one of those old disposable ones. Yeah, remember those? My hands were shaking, and I fumbled with the damn thing, and by the time I managed to get it out, the creature was already disappearing behind this massive fallen log. I didn't even have time to focus. I snapped a picture in that direction anyway, but I knew I'd missed it. My heart was still racing, and for a second I thought about just getting the hell out of there. But curiosity got the better of me, and I crept up the trail a bit further, trying to see if I could spot it again. The air felt different, heavier almost, like the forest had gone quiet after that commotion. No birds, no wind, just this thick silence that made me feel like I was intruding on something I shouldn't be seeing. I kept looking, trying to convince myself that maybe it was just a trick of the light, or my mind playing games. Then, off in the distance, I noticed something. It was hard to make out, like a dark shape between the trees. It almost looked like a face, just barely visible through the branches. I raised my camera again, zooming in as best as that old thing could manage, and snapped another picture. I stood there for a minute, just staring at it, trying to figure out if what I was seeing was real or just some twisted-up tree stump. It felt like it was watching me back, which sounds ridiculous, I know, but that's the feeling I got. Like there were eyes, deep and hidden, just observing me. I didn't get closer. Something in my gut told me not to. I took a step back, then another, and eventually turned around and started heading back down the trail. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore, that whatever I'd seen was still there, just out of sight. When I finally made it back to my car, I was drenched in sweat, more from nerves than the hike itself. I sat there for a while, just trying to make sense of it. I even laughed at myself a bit, trying to brush it off as nothing more than my imagination. But when I got those photos developed, I swear that second one, the one with the face, it still creeps me out. It's blurry, obviously, and I can't say for sure what it is. Most people I've shown it to think it's just a knot in a tree or a shadow, but there's something about it that still makes the hair on my neck stand up. I ended up going back there twice after that, partly because I wanted answers, partly because I just couldn't let it go. Both times it was like nothing had ever happened. The trail was quiet, almost too normal, and I didn't hear or see anything out of the ordinary. No weird sounds, no glimpses of dark shapes moving through the trees. It was just calm. Almost like the forest had swallowed up whatever I'd seen and decided it wasn't going to show itself again. I've thought about it a lot over the years. I mean, I know how it sounds. I saw Bigfoot or whatever, but I'm not even sure if that's what it was. It felt more primal than that, like something ancient that didn't belong in this time or place. It's hard to explain, but the memory of it feels vivid, like it happened yesterday. I can still picture the way it moved, the muscles rippling under its dark fur, the sheer size of it. It wasn't just some guy in a suit, and it definitely wasn't a bear. Every now and then, I think about going back again, just to see if maybe I'll get another glimpse. But there's a part of me that's scared of what I might find, or worse, what I won't. The not knowing is what gets to me the most, I think. Like, did I really see what I thought I saw? Or was it just a trick of the mind, some weird combination of shadows and adrenaline? I guess I'll never really know. But one thing's for sure, I've never felt the same about hiking alone since then. I still hike, but there's always that nagging feeling in the back of my mind, especially when I'm deep in the woods and everything goes quiet. It's like I'm waiting for that sound again, that crashing in the underbrush that tells me I'm not alone. And honestly, part of me hopes I never hear it again. Because whatever it wasn't something I was meant to see. And I think the forest was just reminding me of that. I never thought I'd be here writing such an account, but after so many years of trying to ignore what happened, I think the time has come to share it. We're talking about the 1970s in Lake Quinault. My friend Mike and I used to love riding our motorcycles through the quarries there. We knew every shortcut, every curve. It was our favorite place to spend a few hours and forget about the world. Nothing much happened there, at least until that particular day. It was a Saturday afternoon. The sun was just starting to hide behind the trees, giving the sky an orange tinge, and I remember that the air was heavy, almost stuffy. We were walking slowly, enjoying the scenery and chatting. Suddenly Mike stopped abruptly, pointing to a clearing at the edge of the forest. Something was moving among the trees. At first, I thought it was a stray cow. It was big, thin, and covered in dark hair. It seemed to be coming out of the forest, as if it was about to cross our path. But it was when the thing emerged fully from the shadows that I realized it wasn't a cow. The thing was huge. It must have been 2.5 meters long, and it was walking on 2 legs. Its hair was thick, brown, and covered its entire body. I stood frozen for a second, trying to process what I was seeing. Mike looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. Startled, incredulous, he only managed to let out a, "Dude, what the hell is that?" The creature was focused on 2 deer that were grazing up ahead. I swear, at that moment it looked like a scene from a documentary, you know? That giant beast took off running, and the deer shot off in the opposite direction, as if their lives depended on it. The way the thing ran, it didn't look human, but it didn't look totally animal either. It was as if it had perfect coordination, each step long and precise. When the deer moved away, the creature stopped, as if it had lost interest. That's when I felt a chill run down my spine. It looked in our direction for a moment. I don't know if it really saw us or if it just noticed the movement of the motorcycles, but I could feel my neck beating. Mike was so still that I thought he had stopped breathing. The thing then turned around and went back into the forest, disappearing into the trees as if it had never been there. We didn't move for a good few minutes. The noise of the forest gradually returned, but my head was a complete blank. I didn't know what to think. I don't even know how long we stood there, just looking in the direction the thing had gone. Finally, Mike started the bike and gave me a look that said it all. Let's get out of here. Without a word, we took the same route back, only this time every rustle in the undergrowth sounded like a warning, every shadow was a threat. When we finally got home, we told Mike's father, hoping for some joke, some rational explanation that would make us laugh at ourselves. But he just gave us a serious look, took a deep drag on his cigarette and said, "You've probably seen a Sasquatch." I remember he said it in such a casual way that it gave me the creeps. It wasn't a joke. It was a real possibility. After that day, we avoided the quarry for a long time. I didn't talk about it much with Mike, but we both knew we didn't want to risk another encounter. However, that wasn't the only strange thing that happened in the area. A few weeks later, we were camping nearby and heard something walking heavily around our tent in the middle of the night. It wasn't a deer or a bear. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and heavy. We stood in silence, paralyzed, until it went away. Another time, we were returning home after an afternoon of fishing, and we heard a scream. It was a sound I'd never heard before, something between a roar and a wail, coming from the middle of the forest. The kind of sound that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up instantly. Mike's dad said it was just animals communicating, but there was something about that sound that seemed much more conscious. Since then, I haven't been able to look at that area in the same way. I remember how normal everything seemed, how those motorcycle rides were simply a way to relax and enjoy nature. Now, every time I go back there, and I admit there haven't been many since, I feel a weight, a sense that we're not as welcome as we thought. I'm not here to convince anyone that it was a Sasquatch. I still catch myself trying to rationalize it, thinking that maybe it was a bear or some kind of animal that I just didn't know about. But none of that makes sense when I remember the details, the way it walked, the way it seemed to understand what it was doing, the impossible height. It wasn't a hallucination. I was there, and so was Mike. I know that for many people this sounds ridiculous, something out of the horror stories we tell around the campfire. But for me, it was real. And that's the problem. When you see something you can't explain, something that doesn't fit in with anything you know, it marks you. You start to doubt reality, the things you've always taken for granted. To this day, I don't know what that really was. Life went on, I moved on, but every time I hear stories about Sasquatch, something turns in my stomach. It's as if, for a moment, I'm back in that quarry, with the sun going down, watching that creature disappear into the trees. The kind of thing you just can't forget. So that's it. Maybe it's not the most exciting story anyone's ever read here, but it's mine. And to this day, every time I see a dense forest, I can't help but wonder what might be hiding there, out of sight. Maybe I'll never know, but honestly, I prefer it that way. I've never been much of a storyteller, but after seeing a few people here sharing similar things, I thought it was worth sharing what happened to Mike and me that night in Satsop. That was in the 80s, and I still remember it as if it had happened yesterday. It was an early morning like any other. We were coming back from a baseball game that had ended late. You know how it is. It's a close game. Everyone stays up afterwards discussing the plays, laughing and so on. By the time we decided to leave, it was well after midnight. Satsop is a small town. Practically nothing happens there. And at that time, there wasn't even much street lighting. We were walking along the dirt road that ran through the woods, chatting about the game and laughing, when we started to hear a noise that honestly gave me a strange feeling. It was kind of a low sound, like heavy footsteps stepping on dry branches. But what alerted me was their regularity. It was no ordinary animal. It didn't sound like a deer or anything like that. At first, we just exchanged a look like, "Do you hear that too?" We tried to ignore it, but as we continued walking, it became clear that it was following us. With every step we took, there was that sound behind us, as if it was mirroring our movements. I'm not one to be easily frightened, but something was wrong. We tried to walk faster, and the footsteps quickened too, without running, but keeping pace with us. That's when Mike turned back and went pale. I didn't need to ask him what he was seeing. I knew there was something there, and it was getting closer. When I looked, my eyes adjusted to the dimness, and I saw that huge silhouette. Covered in grey fur, it was much bigger than anyone I had ever seen. It was at a distance where I could see the shape, but not the details of the face, and that was even more frightening. It was as if the thing was studying us, in no hurry at all, with no intention of hiding. The only thing we could think of was to run. Our hearts were pounding in our throats, and we didn't look back. We ran to Mrs. Thompson's house, a neighbor who lived nearby. I remember banging on the door like crazy, so hard I thought I was going to break the glass. Mike was next to me, looking back every second, and the look of terror on his face told me that the thing was still following us. Mrs. Thompson opened the door looking confused and scared, and we barely had time to explain. I just shouted something like, "There's something, let us in." She stepped out, looked where Mike was pointing, and I'll never forget the look on her face. She saw it. I know she saw it because she froze for a second and then pulled us inside in such a hurry that I almost tripped. She slammed the door, and I remember the sound of the lock being turned. We stood there, in her living room, panting, while she peered through the curtain at the window. "Oh my God," was all she managed to say. I plucked up the courage to look through the crack and saw the creature standing in the garden. It wasn't trying to get in or anything, it was just standing there, looking at the house. It was as if it knew we were looking back. After a few minutes, which seemed like an eternity, it turned around and started walking towards the river, which was further on. It didn't run, it didn't make any sudden movements. It simply walked away, in such a calm way that it almost made me doubt what I had seen. We were all silent, as if any sound could call it back. Mrs. Thompson just told us to stay there until dawn, and that's exactly what we did. The next day, after the sun had risen, we went out to see if there was any sign of what had happened. And there was. Huge footprints in the garden, marked in the soft earth. They looked human, but they were much bigger and wider, with well-defined toes. We followed the marks as far as the river, but then they disappeared into the water. I remember Mike trying to measure one of the footprints with his foot, and the difference was absurd. It was proof that it wasn't just our imagination. Some people in the neighborhood heard about what had happened, and there was even a small search of the area. They found some strange marks on the trees, as if something had passed through, but nothing that gave any concrete answers. The sheriff showed up, took a look, but in the end, there wasn't much they could do. They said it could have been a bear, but to this day, I know that wasn't it. You can't forget the way it watched us, as if it understood exactly what we were doing. Since then, I've never walked down that road at night again, and whenever I pass that way, even during the day, I still get a chill down my spine. I don't know what it was, and I may never know, but I can say with certainty that it wasn't just any animal, and that it wasn't something that belonged there. It's strange how something like that can change your perspective. No matter how much you try to explain it, I know what I saw, and I know that Mike and Mrs. Thompson saw it too. To this day, when I see her in town, we exchange a look that says it all, without us having to say a word. And maybe that's what scares me the most, the idea that somehow it's still out there, walking through the trees, watching, waiting, and that next time, maybe it won't be so patient. Whatever it is, I hope I never cross its path again.